In the summer of 1718, a man with a beard woven with slow-burning fuses stood on the deck of a 40-gun warship he had stolen and watched the horizon for sails. The fuses smoldered against his jaw, threading ribbons of gray smoke around his face so that he appeared to anyone watching from a distance to be a figure emerging from the mouth of hell itself. His name was Edward Teach. The world would remember him as Blackbeard. And behind him, anchored in the shallow turquoise waters of a harbor on the island of New Providence, lay the capital of a nation that existed on no map, answered to no king, and governed itself by rules more equitable than anything the civilized world had yet produced. Nassau, a sun-blasted, rum-soaked settlement of perhaps 1,000 souls clinging to the edge of a harbor so naturally protected by sandbars and coral heads that the largest warships of the Royal Navy could not enter without running aground. Within its boundaries, there were no lords and no serfs. No man could be flogged at the whim of a superior. Every crew elected its captain by majority vote, and every captain served at the pleasure of the men who had chosen him. The plunder taken from merchant ships and Spanish galleons was divided according to written articles that every man signed before sailing, articles that specified not only each person's fair share but also compensation for injuries sustained in battle. Lose an eye and you received a predetermined sum. Lose a limb and the sum was greater. In decades before anything resembling workers' compensation existed anywhere on Earth, pirates had invented disability insurance. What happened next, when the British Crown finally turned its attention to this anarchic republic, would determine whether 1,000 criminals' experiment in self-governance could survive the full weight of the most powerful empire on the planet. The answer would arrive in the form of a single ship carrying a new governor with orders to offer every pirate on the island a choice that was no choice at all: accept a royal pardon and surrender everything you have built, or hang. But to understand how the British Empire came to view a collection of drunken sea raiders as an existential threat worth crushing, you first have to understand what they had actually built. And because the Republic of Pirates was not merely a hideout, it was an idea. And ideas, as the men who would eventually write the American Constitution understood 60 years later, are far more dangerous than cannons. The fullest account of what happened on New Providence during those 12 extraordinary years comes from a constellation of primary sources, none of them entirely reliable and all of them indispensable. Captain Charles Johnson's A General History of the Pirates, published in 1724, remains the foundational text, a work so detailed and so suspiciously well-informed that scholars have debated for 3 centuries whether Captain Johnson was a pseudonym for Daniel Defoe. Whether or not Defoe held the pen, the book draws on trial transcripts, sworn depositions, and interviews with men who had sailed alongside Blackbeard, like Charles Vane and Calico Jack Rackham. Supplementing Johnson are the colonial records of the Bahamas, the official correspondence of Woodes Rogers himself, Admiralty court documents from pirate trials in London, Boston, and Charleston, and the personal accounts of merchants and naval officers who encountered these pirates firsthand. Colin Woodard's 2007 work, The Republic of Pirates, synthesized these scattered sources into a coherent narrative, tracing the social and political structures that transformed Nassau from an abandoned colonial outpost into something that looked from certain angles like a functioning democracy. These sources do not agree on every detail. Pirates were not meticulous record keepers, and the men who prosecuted them had every incentive to exaggerate their villainy. But the broad strokes emerge with remarkable clarity, and the picture they paint is stranger and more compelling than any fiction. To find the origins of the Republic of Pirates, you have to look not at the Caribbean but at the gray, rain-lashed dockyards of England at the turn of the 18th century, because the men who built Nassau's pirate republic did not emerge from nowhere. They were products of a specific historical moment, a specific set of grievances, and a specific world that had used them up and thrown them away. The year was 1700, and the English sailor was among the most wretched creatures in the Western world. Consider his life. He had likely gone to sea as a boy, perhaps at 12 or 13, driven by poverty or the false promise of adventure. He slept in a hammock slung below decks in a space so cramped that his shoulders touched the men on either side. His diet consisted primarily of salt beef that had been preserved in barrels for months, sometimes years, and ship's biscuit so infested with weevils that experienced sailors learned to eat in the dark to avoid seeing what crawled across their food. Fresh water turned green in its casks within weeks of departure. Scurvy loosened his teeth and opened old wounds. Tropical fevers killed his mates in clusters, and the bodies were heaved over the side with perfunctory prayers that grew shorter as the voyage wore on. For this he was paid a pittance. A common sailor in the Royal Navy at the turn of the century earned roughly 24 shillings per month, when he was paid at all, which was not guaranteed. The Admiralty routinely withheld wages for months or years, and it was not uncommon for a sailor to complete an entire commission and receive nothing. Merchant vessels paid marginally better but extracted their pound of flesh through other mechanisms. Captains on merchant ships were petty tyrants, answerable to ship owners who lived in London townhouses and had never set foot on a rolling deck. Flogging was routine. A captain could order a man lashed for insubordination, for slowness, for a perceived lack of enthusiasm, or for no stated reason at all. The cat o' nine tails was not a metaphor. It was a whip of 9 knotted cords that stripped the skin from a man's back in parallel furrows, and its use required no judicial proceeding, no witnesses, and no appeal. The class structure aboard an English vessel in 1700 was a precise miniature of English society itself. Officers came from respectable families. They dined on fresh provisions kept in private stores. They slept in cabins with doors that closed. They administered punishment downward and received deference upward. Common sailors occupied a position closer to livestock than to citizens. They had no vote, no voice in the ship's operations, no mechanism for complaint, and no legal protection against abuse. A captain who killed a sailor through negligence or brutality faced at worst a polite inquiry by men of his own class who understood that maintaining order aboard ship sometimes required harsh measures. This was the world that produced pirates, not romance, not adventure, not some innate love of lawlessness. The men who would build the Republic of Nassau went to sea because poverty left them no alternative, endured conditions that would be classified as torture by any modern standard, and discovered that the systems governing their lives had been designed entirely for the benefit of those who governed them. The leap from abused sailor to pirate was not a leap into criminality. It was a leap toward the only form of autonomy available to men at the bottom of the most rigid class system in the Atlantic world. The specific catalyst was the War of the Spanish Succession. From 1701 to 1714, England, the Dutch Republic, and the Holy Roman Empire fought France and Spain for control of the European balance of power and, by extension, the colonial holdings that financed it. The war was fought on land across Flanders and Bavaria, but its most consequential theater for our purposes was the Caribbean. The sugar islands of the West Indies were among the most valuable pieces of real estate on earth, generating wealth that flowed directly into the treasuries of whichever European monarch controlled them. To contest that control, every belligerent nation turned to a practice as old as naval warfare itself: privateering. A privateer was, in legal terms, a licensed pirate. A ship captain received a letter of marque from his sovereign authorizing him to attack and capture enemy merchant vessels. The privateer kept a share of whatever he seized, typically between half and 2/3, with the remainder flowing to the crown. The arrangement was elegant in its cynicism. The state gained a navy it did not have to pay for, accrued by men who fought with the ferocity of personal financial interest rather than patriotic duty. The privateers gained legal cover for acts that would otherwise see them hanged, and the enemy lost merchant ships, trade revenue, and the confidence of its colonial populations. During the War of the Spanish Succession, thousands of English, Scottish, and Irish sailors served as privateers in the Caribbean. They learned the waters, they learned the shipping lanes, they learned which harbors were poorly defended, and which merchant captains carried gold beneath their tea. They learned, most importantly, what it felt like to operate outside the crushing hierarchy of the Royal Navy, to serve aboard vessels where the captain's authority derived from competence and results rather than birth and commission, and where the profits of their labor were shared rather than confiscated. Then, in 1714, the war ended. The Treaty of Utrecht was signed, and the Crown, with the stroke of a pen, rendered every privateer in the Western Hemisphere unemployed. The letters of marque expired. The ships that had been commissioned for war were recalled or decommissioned. The sailors who had spent a decade fighting for profit under legal protection were expected to return overnight to the merchant service or the Royal Navy, to the floggings, to the rancid biscuit, to the 24 shillings a month that might or might not arrive, to the captains who treated them as something between servants and animals. Thousands of these men looked at what awaited them and made a calculation that was, in its own brutal way, entirely rational. They had ships. They had weapons. They had hard-won knowledge of every cove and current in the Caribbean. They knew which trade routes carried silver from Potosi and which carried sugar from Jamaica. And they knew from bitter experience that the legal economy had nothing to offer them except a return to the conditions that had driven them to sea in the first place. They chose piracy. And they chose Nassau. The island of New Providence sits near the northern edge of the Bahamian archipelago, a low-lying strip of limestone and scrub approximately 21 miles long and 7 miles wide. In the first years of the 18th century, it was, by the standards of Caribbean real estate, almost worthless. The soil was too thin for sugar. The terrain was too flat and scrubby for timber. There was no gold, no silver, no resource that might attract the sustained attention of a European power. England had claimed the Bahamas and appointed a series of governors, but the governors tended to arrive, assess the poverty of their new domain, and either leave voluntarily or succumb to tropical disease. By 1706, the last functioning royal governor had departed, and New Providence existed in a state of effective abandonment. But what New Providence lacked in agricultural value, it possessed in nautical advantage. Its harbor was a masterpiece of natural fortification. The approach was guarded by a long, shallow sandbar that allowed only vessels with a draft of 9 feet or less to enter. Sloops and brigantines, the preferred vessels of pirates, drew 5 or 6 feet. Ships of the line, the 60 and 70 gun warships that were the Royal Navy's instruments of dominance, drew 20 feet or more. This single geographical fact meant that any pirate who reached Nassau's harbor was functionally immune to naval assault. The great warships could blockade the harbor entrance, but they could not enter it, and Nassau's eastern shore offered a dozen escape channels through the shallow banks and coral heads that only local sailors knew how to navigate. The harbor itself was wide, calm, and deep enough within the bar to shelter dozens of vessels. Fresh water was available from wells dug into the limestone. The surrounding banks teemed with fish, lobster, and sea turtles, and the island sat at the intersection of some of the most heavily trafficked shipping lanes in the Atlantic world. The Straits of Florida, through which Spanish treasure fleets carried the wealth of the Americas back to Seville, lay barely a day's sail to the west. The windward passage between Cuba and Hispaniola, the primary route connecting the Caribbean to European ports, was within easy striking distance. A pirate based in Nassau could reach rich hunting grounds in any direction within 48 hours and return to the safety of the harbor before any warship could respond. It was, in short, the perfect pirate base. And beginning around 1706, that is exactly what it became. The early settlement grew organically, without any founding document or deliberate act of creation. Privateers whose commissions had lapsed, deserters from the Royal Navy, runaway indentured servants, escaped enslaved people, and assorted refugees from the brutalities of the colonial economy began to accumulate on New Providence like driftwood gathering in the crook of a river. They came in ones and twos at first, then in crews, then in fleets. They built rough shelters along the harbor front from salvaged ship timbers and palm thatch. They established taverns that were little more than canvas awnings stretched between posts, where rum was sold by the cup and the primary currency was stolen Spanish silver. They careened their ships on the white sand beaches, scraping barnacles from hulls and replacing rotted planking with timber stripped from captured prizes. By 1713, the year before the Treaty of Utrecht flooded the Caribbean with unemployed privateers, Nassau was already home to several hundred residents and had developed the basic infrastructure of a functioning port town. There were warehouses for storing plunder. There were workshops where ships could be repaired and refitted. There were traders, some legitimate and some not, who bought stolen cargo at deep discounts and shipped it to the American colonies, where merchants in Boston, New York, and Charleston were happy to purchase cut-rate goods without asking uncomfortable questions about their provenance. What there was not conspicuously was any form of central authority. No governor, no magistrate, no sheriff, no church with a clergyman empowered to solemnize marriages or adjudicate disputes, no tax collector, no customs officer, no representative of any European power claiming jurisdiction over the settlement's inhabitants. And the residents of Nassau answered to no one but themselves and, when at sea, to the captains they had chosen. This is the point at which the story becomes something more than a tale of maritime crime, because the absence of imposed authority did not produce the chaos that political theorists from Thomas Hobbes onward had predicted. It did not devolve into a war of all against all, a savage struggle in which the strong devoured the weak, and life was, in Hobbes's famous formulation, solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. What emerged instead was a system. Rough, imperfect, frequently enforced at the point of a cutlass, but recognizably a system, with rules, institutions, and mechanisms of collective decision-making that bore a startling resemblance to the democratic principles that Enlightenment philosophers were at that very moment theorizing about in the salons of Paris and London. The foundation of this system was the Pirate Articles. Before any pirate ship sailed from Nassau, its crew gathered and negotiated a set of written rules that every man was required to sign or mark with an X. These articles were not handed down by the captain. They were debated, amended, and ratified by the crew as a whole. The process bore a closer resemblance to a constitutional convention than to the issuance of military orders. The articles varied from crew to crew, but their core provisions were remarkably consistent across dozens of ships operating over a period of more than a decade, suggesting a common legal culture that had developed through practice and precedent. The Articles of Bartholomew Roberts, perhaps the most successful pirate of the era, survive in detail and are representative. Article 1 established the distribution of plunder. The captain received 2 shares, the quartermaster received 1.5 shares, the gunner, boatswain, and other officers received 1.25 shares. Every common sailor received 1 full share. The ratio between the highest paid man aboard and the lowest was 2-1. On a Royal Navy vessel of the same period, the ratio between an admiral's pay and an ordinary seaman's was roughly 14-1. And that calculation did not account for the prize money, political sinecure, and social advancement available to officers and utterly closed to common sailors. On a merchant vessel, the ratio was even more extreme, and with captains and ship owners taking the vast majority of profits while crews received fixed wages that bore no relationship to the voyage's success. The pirate system was, by the standards of its time, radically egalitarian. Every man who risked his life received a meaningful share of the reward. The captain received more, but only modestly more, and his premium was understood as compensation for the burden of command rather than a reflection of superior social worth. Article 2 addressed injury. A man who lost his right arm in battle received 600 pieces of 8, roughly equivalent to 6 years' wages for a common sailor. A left arm was worth 500 pieces of 8. A right leg, 500. A left leg, 400. Loss of an eye, 100. These sums were paid from the common treasury before any division of plunder, meaning that the welfare of injured crewmen took priority over individual profit. The modern mind recognizes this immediately. It was insurance. It was workers' compensation. It was a social safety net. Crude but functional. Created by men whom the respectable world dismissed as savages. Article 3 governed behavior aboard ship. Gambling was prohibited. Not on moral grounds, but because disputes over card debts generated violence that threatened the crew's cohesion. Lights and candles were to be extinguished by 8 in the evening. Any man who wished to drink after 8 could do so on the open deck. Women were not to be brought aboard, or a rule driven less by misogyny than by the practical observation that competition for sexual partners generated the same corrosive jealousy as gambling debts. Fighting between crewmates was forbidden while at sea. Disputes were to be settled ashore, by duel if necessary, under the supervision of the quartermaster. Article 4 addressed cowardice and desertion. A man who fled his post during battle forfeited his share of plunder and was marooned, left alone on a sandbar or deserted island with a pistol, a bottle of water, and a single bullet. The punishment was severe but carried a logic that the men understood. Every pirate's survival depended on every other pirate doing his job under fire. A man who broke that compact endangered everyone and deserved exile from the community he had betrayed. And then there was the matter of leadership. The captain of a pirate ship was elected. This simple fact was so foreign to the world that surrounded the pirate republic that it is worth pausing to absorb its implications. In the Royal Navy, captains were appointed by the Admiralty, typically on the basis of family connections, political patronage, and social class. In the merchant fleet, captains were appointed by ship owners. In neither case did the men who served under the captain have any role in selecting him, any mechanism for removing him, or any formal right to question his decisions. On a pirate ship, the crew voted. One man, one vote. The candidate who received the majority became captain. His authority during battle was absolute. He directed the ship's movements, chose targets, and commanded the assault. In this narrow domain, his word was law because combat required unified command, and the pirates were practical men who understood that democracy had its limits. But outside of battle, the captain's authority was sharply circumscribed. He could not punish a crewman without the crew's consent. He could not determine the ship's course or next target without a vote. He could not claim special privileges in food, drink, or quarters, and he could be removed from command at any time by majority vote for cowardice, cruelty, incompetence, or any other reason the crew deemed sufficient. The historical record contains numerous instances of pirate captains being deposed mid-voyage and replaced by men the crew considered more capable or more fair. The balance of power was held by the quartermaster, a figure unique to pirate governance. The quartermaster was also elected, and he served as the crew's representative, a check on the captain's authority in much the same way that a legislature checks an executive. He settled disputes between crewmen. He administered punishment when the crew voted to impose it. He managed the distribution of food, water, and plunder. He spoke for the common sailors in any disagreement with the captain. In functional terms, the pirate ship operated under a separation of powers, with the captain holding executive authority in matters of combat and navigation, and the quartermaster holding authority in matters of internal governance and resource allocation. The pirates did not use the language of political philosophy. They did not cite John Locke's theories of the social contract. Though Locke had published his 2 treatises of government just 15 years before Nassau's pirate republic reached its zenith. They did not invoke the natural rights of man, though they lived those rights more fully than any community in the Western world. They simply built what worked. They built a system in which authority flowed upward from the governed rather than downward from the governor, in which leaders served at the pleasure of those they led, in which the fruits of collective labor were distributed with rough equality, and in which written law agreed upon in advance constrained the exercise of power. They built, in other words, a democracy. Not a perfect one, not a complete one. The pirate articles applied only to those who signed them, and the pirates' democratic principles did not prevent them from inflicting terrible violence on the crews of captured ships. Their egalitarianism had limits. Enslaved Africans who joined pirate crews sometimes received equal shares and sometimes did not, and the historical record on this point is contradictory and incomplete. Women were formally excluded from most crews, though exceptions like Anne Bonny and Mary Read would spectacularly challenge that exclusion. The Republic had no courts, no formal judicial process, and no mechanism for redressing grievances beyond direct confrontation and collective vote. But consider the comparison. In 1715, the government of England was a constitutional monarchy in which the right to vote was restricted to property-owning men, a fraction of the adult male population. The members of Parliament purchased their seats. The House of Lords was hereditary. The king retained enormous executive power. Slavery was legal throughout the British Empire and would remain so for another century. Women had no political rights whatsoever. Common sailors in the Royal Navy could be legally kidnapped through impressment, forced to serve on warships against their will, flogged for minor infractions, and denied wages for years. The pirates of Nassau had built something that, within its narrow scope, was more democratic, more egalitarian, and more responsive to the governed than anything the British Empire offered its own citizens. They had done it without philosophers, without constitutional conventions, without any of the institutional apparatus that political theorists insisted was necessary for self-governance. Here they had done it because they knew from the scars on their backs what happened when authority was unaccountable, and they had decided collectively that they would rather hang than submit to it again. The man who presided over the early consolidation of this republic was not Blackbeard. Blackbeard would come later, a figure whose fearsome reputation has overshadowed the more consequential leaders who built the world he inherited. The man who first transformed Nassau from a collection of individual pirate crews into something resembling a coherent polity was Benjamin Hornigold. Hornigold was English, probably born around 1680, though the early years of his life are poorly documented. What is known is that he arrived in Nassau sometime around 1713, and already an experienced privateer whose commission had expired with the Treaty of Utrecht, and that he possessed something that most pirates lacked, a strategic mind that extended beyond the next prize. He was tall and physically commanding, with the sun-darkened skin and deliberate movements of a man who had spent most of his adult life at sea. Unlike many of the pirates who would later achieve greater fame, Hornigold was not given to flamboyance. He did not weave fuses into his beard or dress in stolen silk. His authority derived from competence, consistency, and an ability to think in terms of systems rather than incidents. Where other pirate captains saw individual ships to be plundered, Hornigold saw supply lines, strategic positions, and the political dynamics of colonial power. He understood that 100 pirate crews operating independently were a nuisance. 100 pirate crews operating in concert from a defensible harbor with shared infrastructure and mutual obligations were a force that could challenge empires. Under Hornigold's influence, Nassau began to develop the rudiments of collective governance ashore. Pirates who had previously operated as independent crews began to coordinate their activities, sharing intelligence about merchant shipping movements, dividing hunting grounds to avoid competition, and contributing to the maintenance of the harbor and its facilities. Hornigold acted as a first among equals, an unofficial magistrate whose word carried weight not because of any formal office, but because the other captains respected his judgment and recognized that his vision served their collective interest. It was Hornigold who mentored the young Edward Teach, taking the man who would become Blackbeard aboard his own vessel and teaching him the craft of piracy in the waters between Nassau and the American mainland. It was Hornigold who helped establish the informal council of captains that made collective decisions about Nassau's defense and its relations with the outside world. And it was Hornigold, in one of history's more instructive ironies, who would eventually become the instrument of the Republic's destruction. But that betrayal lay years in the future. In 1714 and 1715, as the peace treaty flushed hundreds and then thousands of former privateers into the Caribbean, Nassau swelled. The harbor that had sheltered a few dozen vessels now accommodated scores. The tent city along the waterfront expanded into a sprawling settlement of rough-built structures stretching back from the shore. The population, which had numbered perhaps 300 in 1713, climbed toward 600, then 800, then 1,000. Pirates arrived from Jamaica, from the Carolinas, from the coast of Africa, from virtually every maritime theater where the war had been fought. They brought with them ships, weapons, skills, and a shared experience of exploitation that gave the settlement a cohesion it might otherwise have lacked. And then, in the summer of 1715, an event occurred that transformed Nassau from a successful pirate haven into the wealthiest outlaw settlement in the history of the Western Hemisphere. On July 31st, 1715, a Spanish treasure fleet of 12 ships departed Havana for Spain, carrying the accumulated wealth of the Americas. Gold bars from the mines of Mexico, silver coins from the foundries of Potosi, emeralds from Colombia, Chinese porcelain and silk that had crossed the Pacific to Manila and been transshipped across Mexico to Veracruz. The fleet carried an estimated 14 million pesos in registered cargo and an unknown quantity of contraband wealth that merchants and colonial officials had smuggled aboard to avoid taxation. In modern terms, the fleet's cargo was worth hundreds of millions of dollars. 6 days later, a hurricane caught the fleet off the east coast of Florida. 11 of the 12 ships were driven onto the reefs and sandbars between what is now Cape Canaveral and Fort Pierce. Over 1,000 sailors drowned. The treasure settled into the sand and shallow water along 40 miles of coastline. Word reached Nassau within weeks, and the pirates came. They came in every vessel that could float, from ocean-going brigantines to fishing canoes. They dove on the wrecks, hauling up silver coins by the bucket and gold bars by the sack. They fought with Spanish salvage crews who had been sent from Havana to recover the crown's property. They hauled their plunder back to Nassau, where it flooded the settlement's economy with more wealth than most of these men had seen in their collective lifetimes. The 1715 treasure fleet disaster did not create the Republic of Pirates, but it capitalized it. The influx of Spanish silver gave Nassau the economic base it needed to sustain itself as an independent entity. The treasure funded ship repairs, weapons purchases, and the provisioning of crews for increasingly ambitious raids. It attracted still more pirates to the settlement, drawn by reports of easy wealth and a community where a common man could live free. And it drew the attention of the British Empire, which began to receive alarm dispatches from colonial governors in the Carolinas and Jamaica, warning that the pirates of Nassau were growing too powerful and too numerous to ignore. In the taverns along the harbor front, where stolen rum flowed freely and men whose backs bore the scars of naval flogging sat as equals around rough-hewn tables, the mood was one of defiant celebration. They had built something, a place where the rules were their own, a place where a man's worth was measured by his courage and his usefulness to the crew, not by the circumstances of his birth, a place where authority answered to those it governed, where wealth was shared, and where the written law applied equally to every man who signed his name or scratched his mark upon it. None of them knew how long it could last. The smartest among them suspected it would not last forever. The British Empire was the most powerful military force on earth, and its patience for an independent pirate republic operating in its colonial waters would not extend indefinitely. Anash. Somewhere in London, in the paneled offices of the Admiralty and the Colonial Office, men in powdered wigs were already discussing what to do about Nassau. But for now, in these years of improbable freedom, the pirates of New Providence had achieved something that the political philosophers of Europe said was impossible. They had proven that men who had been treated as less than human could, when given the chance, govern themselves. That democracy did not require educated elites or inherited institutions, that it could grow from the bottom up, from the shared experience of suffering and the practical need for cooperation, written in salt-stained ink on parchment that smelled of gunpowder in the sea. The captains who would define the Republic's brief golden age were gathering now. Hornigold, the strategist. Teach, the terrifying figurehead. Charles Vane, the uncompromising radical who would refuse to surrender under any terms. Calico Jack Rackham, the dandy whose crew would include two of the most remarkable women in pirate history. Samuel Bellamy, Black Sam, who would articulate the pirate philosophy more eloquently than any of his peers and then perish in a storm off Cape Cod before he could see what became of the world he helped create. Each of these figures carried a different vision of what the Republic could be. Their agreements would build it. Their disagreements would fracture it. And the choices each of them made when the Crown finally came to reclaim Nassau would determine not only their individual fates, but the legacy of the most audacious experiment in self-governance that the 18th century Atlantic world had ever seen. The story of how they rose, how they ruled, and how they fell begins with the man who saw it all coming before anyone else did, and who understood with a clarity that bordered on prophecy that the greatest threat to the Republic of Pirates would come not from the British Navy's cannons, but from an offer that most pirates would find impossible to refuse. That man was Benjamin Hornigold. And the story of the Republic's golden age begins not with his wisdom, but with his protege, the young sailor he plucked from obscurity and transformed into the most terrifying figure in the Atlantic world. Edward Teach arrived in Nassau sometime around 1714, one among hundreds of former privateers washing up on New Providence's shores in the months following the Treaty of Utrecht. The details of his early life are frustratingly scarce. He was almost certainly from Bristol, a city whose docks had produced generations of sailors, smugglers, and privateers. He had served aboard privateer vessels during the War of the Spanish Succession, probably in the Caribbean, and had demonstrated enough competence and physical courage to catch Hornigold's attention. Beyond that, the historical record before his arrival in Nassau is essentially blank. Edward Teach emerged from the anonymity of the common sailor class as suddenly and completely as if the sea itself had produced him. What Hornigold saw in the young man was potential of a particular kind. Teach was physically enormous by the standards of his era, well over 6 feet tall, broad through the chest and shoulders, with a natural capacity for violence that could be directed rather than merely endured. But size and ferocity were common enough among pirates. What set Teach apart was his understanding of theater. He grasped, instinctively or through observation, that a pirate's most valuable weapon was not his cannon or his cutlass, but his reputation. A merchant captain who believed he faced certain death would surrender without firing a shot. A merchant captain who thought he might fight his way free would resist, and resistance meant casualties, damage to the prize vessel, and the destruction of cargo that could otherwise be sold. The most profitable pirate was not the most violent pirate. He was the most frightening one. Hornigold gave Teach command of a captured sloop and sent him out to learn his trade in the waters around Nassau. Teach proved an apt student. He was a competent navigator and a capable ship handler. But his genius lay in the cultivation of an image so terrifying that it preceded him across the Caribbean like a pressure wave before a storm. He grew his famous beard to extraordinary length, braiding it into multiple plaits that he tied with small colored ribbons. Before engaging a target, he wove slow-burning hemp fuses into the braids and lit them, so that his face was wreathed in curling smoke, his eyes glinting through the haze like something that had climbed out of a furnace. He hung multiple pistols and knives from a bandolier across his chest. He cultivated stories of his own cruelty, some of them true and some almost certainly exaggerated, understanding that every tale of Blackbeard's savagery that reached the ears of a merchant captain was worth more than a broadside of cannon fire. The persona worked. Within 2 years of receiving his first command, Blackbeard had become the most feared pirate in the Americas. Merchant vessels struck their colors at the sight of his flag. Coastal towns from the Carolinas to Honduras posted lookouts and trembled at rumors of his approach. He captured a French slave ship called La Concorde, renamed her Queen Anne's Revenge, mounted 40 guns on her decks, and sailed with a fleet of smaller vessels that together constituted a squadron more powerful than anything the colonial navies could put against him. And yet, for all his theatrical ferocity, the historical record suggests that Blackbeard was considerably less bloodthirsty than his reputation implied. There is no verified account of him killing a single captive. His preferred method was intimidation followed by negotiation. Die Finauer. He would appear in a cloud of smoke, discharge his pistols into the air, roar threats through a speaking trumpet, and wait for the inevitable surrender. Once the prize was taken, he typically relieved the vessel of its valuable cargo, helped himself to any weapons, ammunition, and naval stores he needed, and allowed the captured crew to proceed on their way. He was performing a role, and the performance was so effective that the violence it was designed to prevent rarely became necessary. This distinction mattered because it illuminated something essential about the pirate economy. The pirates of Nassau were not waging war. They were conducting business. Their targets were not enemy combatants, but merchant vessels carrying goods from one colonial port to another. Destroying those vessels or massacring their crews served no purpose. The pirates needed the merchant fleet to continue operating because without merchant ships to capture, the entire pirate economy collapsed. They were parasites in the ecological sense, organisms whose survival depended on the continued health of their host. The most successful pirate captains understood this relationship intuitively and calibrated their violence accordingly. Blackbeard was the most visible manifestation of Nassau's power, but he was not the only one. In the years between 1715 and 1718, the Republic of Pirates reached its zenith, and the harbor at Nassau sheltered a constellation of captains whose combined operations effectively shut down legitimate commerce across vast stretches of the Caribbean and the Atlantic seaboard. Charles Vane was, in many respects, Blackbeard's opposite. Where Teach cultivated a terrifying image in the service of practical efficiency, Vane was genuinely, uncompromisingly violent. He was English, probably from a working-class background in or near London, and he arrived in Nassau with a reputation for cruelty that even other pirates found excessive. He tortured captured sailors to reveal where valuables were hidden. He burned vessels he had no use for. He threatened to kill anyone, pirate or otherwise, who attempted to limit his autonomy. Yet Vane was also the most politically committed pirate in Nassau. He was the purest expression of the Republic's founding ideology, the man for whom piracy was not merely a career but a cause. He articulated through his actions, if not through speeches, an absolute refusal to submit to any authority he had not chosen. When the British Crown eventually offered pardons to the pirates of Nassau, Vane would be the most vocal and the most dangerous opponent of surrender. His intransigence would make him both a symbol of pirate defiance and a liability to those who sought accommodation with the empire. Between Blackbeard's showmanship and Vane's radicalism stood a range of other captains, each contributing to the Republic's power in different ways. Calico Jack Rackham earned his nickname from his habit of wearing calico clothing, a flamboyance that masked a shrewd, if occasionally reckless, tactical mind. Rackham's historical significance would ultimately derive less from his own exploits than from the two women who served in his crew, Anne Bonny and Mary Read, whose stories would challenge every assumption the 18th century world held about women's capacity for courage, violence, and self-determination. But in 1716 and 1717, Rackham was still a rising figure, serving as quartermaster aboard Vane's ship and absorbing the lessons of pirate governance that he would later apply as captain of his own vessel. Samuel Bellamy, known as Black Sam for his refusal to wear the powdered wigs fashionable among men of means, was perhaps the most philosophically articulate of Nassau's captains. Born in Devon around 1689, Bellamy had come to the Caribbean seeking treasure from the 1715 Spanish wrecks and turned to piracy when salvage failed to produce the fortune he sought. He was handsome, charismatic, and possessed of a gift for language that allowed him to express the pirate worldview with a precision that Johnson's general history preserved. Bellamy's most famous speech, delivered to the captain of a captured merchant vessel who had refused an invitation to join the pirates, encapsulated everything the Republic stood for. The captured captain had invoked his conscience, claiming he could not justify robbery. Bellamy's reported response cut to the heart of the class system that had produced both men. "I am a free prince," he declared, "and I have as much authority to make war on the whole world as he who has 100 sail of ships at sea and an army of 100,000 men in the field. And this my conscience tells me. But there is no arguing with such sniveling puppies who allow superiors to kick them about deck at pleasure. and pin their faith upon a pimp of a parson who neither practices nor believes what he puts upon the churl-headed fools he preaches to. The speech, whether reported verbatim or polished by Johnson, expressed a worldview that was simultaneously radical and coherent. Bellamy was asserting that sovereignty derived not from royal commission or inherited title, but from the capacity and willingness to exercise power. That the distinction between a pirate and a king was one of scale rather than kind. That the merchant captain who submitted to exploitation by his social betters and justified it through religion was not morally superior to the pirate who refused to submit but merely more compliant. It was an argument that would have been immediately recognizable to Thomas Paine, writing 60 years later in Common Sense, and it emerged not from a philosopher's study but from the quarterdeck of a stolen ship. Bellamy would not live to see the Republic's fall. In April 1717, his flagship, the Whydah Galley, a former slave ship he had captured and converted into the most powerful pirate vessel in the Atlantic, was caught by a violent nor'easter off Cape Cod. The ship struck a sandbar and broke apart in the surf. Of approximately 146 men aboard, only 2 survived. Bellamy was 28 years old. The Whydah's remains were discovered in 1984 by underwater explorer Barry Clifford, and the artifacts recovered from the wreck, including the ship's bell, thousands of coins, and personal items belonging to the crew, constitute the only positively identified pirate shipwreck ever found. Among the artifacts was a small silk pouch containing a handful of personal effects. The men who crewed the Whydah died carrying, amid the stolen gold, the same small human talismans, lockets, ribbons, carved buttons that any sailor of the era might have treasured. They were, in death as in life, ordinary men in extraordinary circumstances. Bellamy's loss was felt in Nassau, but did not slow the Republic's expansion. By 1717, the pirate fleet operating from New Providence numbered an estimated 24 vessels carrying perhaps 1,500 to 2,000 men. Their raiding range extended from the coast of West Africa to the fishing banks of Newfoundland. They disrupted trade routes that connected Europe, Africa, and the Americas. Insurance rates on merchant shipping soared. Colonial governors from Virginia to Jamaica sent increasingly desperate dispatches to London, warning that if the pirates were not suppressed, transatlantic commerce would grind to a halt. The economic impact was real and quantifiable. Merchant ships began traveling in convoy, adding delays and costs. Some routes were abandoned entirely. The price of imported goods in the American colonies rose as supply constricted. Planters in the Sugar Islands found it increasingly difficult to ship their product to market. The pirates were not merely stealing cargo, they were disrupting the arterial system of an empire that ran on seaborne trade, and every disrupted shipment represented lost revenue not only for merchants and ship owners, but for the crown itself, which depended on customs duties and commercial taxes to fund its military and civil administration. The response from London was, for several years, astonishingly inadequate. The Royal Navy was stretched thin across multiple theaters. Ships that might have been deployed to the Caribbean were needed to patrol European waters, protect the coast of England, and maintain presence in the Mediterranean. Colonial governors had neither the ships nor the men to challenge the pirate fleet directly, and the pirates' base in Nassau's shallow harbor meant that even if a naval squadron were dispatched, it could not root them out through conventional assault. There was also a political dimension to the delay. Piracy in the Caribbean was not a new phenomenon. It had existed in some form since the 16th century. And the British government had a long and complicated history of tolerating, encouraging, and profiting from it when it served imperial interests. Many of the merchants and officials who now demanded action against the pirates had happily purchased stolen goods when the stolen goods came from Spanish or French ships. The line between piracy and privateering had always been a matter of political convenience rather than moral principle. And some voices in London argued that the pirates, whatever their excesses, served a useful function in harassing Spanish commerce and keeping rival colonial powers off balance. But by 1717, the calculus had shifted. The pirates were no longer confining their attacks to enemy shipping. They were seizing British merchant vessels with the same enthusiasm they applied to Spanish ones. And they were disrupting British trade. They were threatening the economic foundations of British colonial power, and they were doing it from a settlement that was at least nominally British territory. The Republic of Pirates had become an embarrassment, an affront to British sovereignty, and an increasingly expensive drain on British commerce. Something had to be done. The man chosen to do it was Woodes Rogers. Rogers was 40 years old in 1717, a Bristol-born former privateer who had circumnavigated the globe between 1708 and 1711 in a voyage that combined genuine exploration with enthusiastic plunder. He had attacked Spanish settlements along the Pacific coast of South America, captured a Manila galleon laden with treasure, and returned to England a wealthy man. During the voyage, his ship had stopped at the island of Juan Fernandez off the Chilean coast, where Rogers rescued a Scottish sailor named Alexander Selkirk, who had been marooned alone for over 4 years. Selkirk's story would later inspire Daniel Defoe to write Robinson Crusoe, a coincidence that places Rogers at the intersection of pirate history and literary history in a manner that even novelists would consider too convenient. Rogers had lost part of his jaw to a musket ball during the Manila galleon engagement and spoke with a slurred, halting delivery that might have undermined a lesser man's authority. It did not undermine his. He possessed the particular kind of credibility that came from having done exactly what the men he was sent to confront had done, only with legal sanction and greater success. He knew how pirates thought because he functionally been one. He understood their motivations, their organizational structures, their strengths, and their vulnerabilities. And he understood, crucially, that the pirates of Nassau could not be defeated by force alone. The harbor's shallow approach made direct naval assault impractical. A blockade would be slow and expensive. And even if Nassau were taken by force, the pirates would simply scatter to other harbors and resume their operations within months. The problem was not the geography. The problem was the community. 1,000 men who had chosen freedom over servitude, who had experienced self-governance and found it preferable to submission, who had nothing waiting for them in the legitimate world except the lash and the forecastle, were not going to surrender because a warship appeared on the horizon. They would have to be offered something. And what they were offered would have to be, or appear to be, better than what they already had. Rogers proposed to the Crown a strategy built on this understanding. He would sail to Nassau not primarily as a military commander, but as a governor, carrying with him a royal proclamation that offered a full pardon to any pirate who surrendered by a specified deadline. The pardon would erase all crimes committed before a certain date. Pirates who accepted it would be free men, permitted to keep whatever wealth they currently possessed and to resume life as lawful subjects of the Crown. Pirates who refused the pardon would be hunted down and hanged. The strategy was elegant because it weaponized the pirates' own internal divisions. Rogers understood that Nassau's pirate community was not monolithic, and some men had turned to piracy out of genuine ideological conviction, a refusal to return to the exploitation of the legitimate maritime economy. But many others had turned to piracy simply because it was more profitable than the alternatives and would happily return to legitimate life if the terms were right. A blanket pardon, combined with the implicit threat of overwhelming force against those who refused it, would fracture the pirate community along precisely this fault line. The ideologues would resist, the pragmatists would accept, and once the pragmatists accepted, the ideologues would find themselves isolated, outnumbered, and vulnerable. The Crown approved the plan. Rogers was appointed Captain General and Governor-in-Chief of the Bahamas, given command of a small squadron of warships, and dispatched across the Atlantic with orders to reclaim Nassau for the British Empire. He sailed from England in the spring of 1718, carrying the king's pardon in his luggage and the knowledge that everything depended on what happened in the first hours after his arrival. If the pirates resisted collectively, his small force could not take the harbor. If they fractured, the Republic was finished. Word of Rogers' approach reached Nassau weeks before his ships appeared on the horizon. The reaction inside the pirate community followed exactly the fault lines Rogers had anticipated. Hornigold, the man who had done more than anyone to build the Republic, was the first prominent captain to declare his willingness to accept the pardon. His reasoning was strategic rather than craven. When Hornigold had watched the pirate community grow beyond its capacity for self-governance, the influx of new arrivals after the 1715 treasure fleet had diluted the original culture of disciplined self-interest. Crews had grown larger, less cohesive, and more prone to the kind of pointless violence that attracted imperial attention without generating profit. Hornigold could see the trajectory. The Royal Navy would come eventually, in force sufficient to blockade the harbor indefinitely, and when it did, every pirate in Nassau would face a binary choice between surrender and death. Better to negotiate from a position of relative strength, while the pardon was still on offer, than to wait until the noose was the only option remaining. There may also have been a deeper calculation. Hornigold had always been a pragmatist. His piracy had been, from the beginning, more strategic than ideological. He had famously refused to attack British ships, confining his raids to French and Spanish vessels, a scruple that had cost him the support of crews who saw no reason to limit their targets based on nationality. This self-imposed restriction suggests a man who never fully abandoned his identity as a British subject, who viewed piracy as an extension of the privateering career the Crown had sanctioned during wartime rather than a repudiation of the Crown itself. For Hornigold, accepting the pardon was not a betrayal of the Republic's principles. It was an acknowledgement that the Republic had always been, at best, a temporary arrangement. Others were not so accommodating. Charles Vane received the news of the approaching pardon with something between contempt and fury. For Vane, the pardon was worse than a threat. It was an insult. It presumed that the pirates of Nassau were criminals seeking forgiveness when in fact they were free men defending their autonomy against an empire that had brutalized them. To accept a pardon was to accept the premise that their way of life was a crime rather than a legitimate alternative to the system that had abused them. It was to surrender not just their ships and their harbor, but their dignity, to crawl back into the hierarchy they had escaped and thank their masters for the privilege of servitude. Vane began to organize resistance. He argued loudly and in public that the pirates should fight, that their harbor was impregnable, that Rogers's squadron was too small to take Nassau by force, that if they held together, the Crown would eventually lose interest, or as it had lost interest before, and leave them alone. He was wrong about the Crown's patience, but he was not entirely wrong about the harbor's defenses, and his arguments carried weight with men who had spent years building a community they were not prepared to abandon. The pirate republic split. Not cleanly, not all at once, but in the way that communities fracture under pressure, through whispered conversations, shifting allegiances, and the slow gravitational pull of self-interest. Men who had fought alongside each other for years found themselves on opposite sides of a question that admitted no compromise. Accept the pardon or refuse it. Submit or resist. There was no middle ground. Blackbeard characteristically chose a third option. He left. In the months before Rogers' arrival, Teach had already begun to distance himself from Nassau. He had taken his fleet north to the coast of the Carolinas, where he conducted the most audacious operation of his career, blockading the harbor of Charleston, South Carolina for nearly a week, capturing 9 vessels and holding the port's shipping hostage until the city's governor sent out a chest of medical supplies that Teach had demanded as ransom. The nature of the demand, medicines rather than gold, has led some historians to speculate that Teach or members of his crew were suffering from syphilis, though the evidence is inconclusive. After the Charleston blockade, Teach deliberately ran his flagship Queen Anne's Revenge aground on a sandbar at Beaufort Inlet, North Carolina, in what many historians believe was a calculated act rather than an accident. He then transferred himself and a small group of favored crewmen to a smaller vessel, marooned the majority of his crew on a barren sandbar, and accepted a pardon from the governor of North Carolina, Charles Eden, who was almost certainly receiving a share of Teach's accumulated plunder in exchange for his cooperation. Blackbeard's exit from the pirate republic was not a rejection of piracy. He would return to raiding within months, operating from the coast of North Carolina with Governor Eden's tacit protection. It was a rejection of Nassau, a recognition that the Republic's days were numbered, and that a man with the right connections could do better on his own than as part of a community about to be crushed. It was also arguably an act of abandonment. The man whom Hornigold had mentored, whom the Republic had made famous, he chose his own survival over the collective project that had given him everything. The Republic of Pirates had produced its first deserter of consequence. His departure left Nassau's defense in the hands of Charles Vane, and whatever Captains Vane could rally to his cause. The stage was set for a confrontation that would determine whether 1,000 men's experiment in self-governance would survive, adapt, or be extinguished entirely. Woodes Rogers' small squadron appeared on the horizon east of New Providence on a morning in late July 1718. The ships materialized slowly in the tropical haze, their sails catching the early light, growing from specks to silhouettes to unmistakable instruments of imperial authority. Rogers had with him 3 warships, the Delicia, the Rose, and the Buck, along with several smaller vessels carrying settlers, supplies, and the administrative apparatus of colonial governance. It was not an invasion fleet. It was something more subtle, and for the pirates who watched from the harbor, potentially more dangerous, a government arriving by sea, prepared to offer mercy to those who would accept it and death to those who would not. Inside the harbor, the scene was one of frantic, contradictory activity. Some pirate crews were already preparing to surrender, lowering their black flags and rowing out toward the approaching squadron in longboats, eager to present themselves as reformed men willing to accept the king's grace. Others were loading their guns, stacking ammunition, and making ready to fight. Along the waterfront, men argued in clusters, their voices rising and falling with the intensity of debates on which their lives literally depended. Vane had positioned his ship, a brigantine loaded with combustibles, near the harbor entrance. His plan was to set the vessel alight and send it drifting toward Rogers's squadron as a fire ship, a floating bomb designed to scatter the approaching warships and buy time for the pirate fleet to escape through the eastern channels. It was a tactic as old as naval warfare, and in the confined approach to Nassau's harbor, it was not a bad one. As Rogers's ships closed the distance, Vane gave the order. The fireship was lit and released, drifting toward the squadron on the tide, flames climbing its rigging, black smoke boiling into the Caribbean sky. The approaching warships scattered exactly as Vane had intended, and their captains hauling on their helms to avoid the burning vessel. In the confusion, Vane and his loyal crews slipped through the eastern passages and vanished into the open sea. It was the last act of organized resistance the Republic of Pirates would ever mount. And it was performed by a single captain with a handful of ships, while the majority of Nassau's pirate community stood on the beaches and watched the British flag rise over their harbor without lifting a hand to stop it. Rogers came ashore to a reception that was part surrender ceremony, part civic welcome, and part barely contained chaos. Hundreds of pirates lined the waterfront, many of them drunk, most of them armed, all of them uncertain about what this new order would mean for their lives. Rogers read the king's proclamation aloud. The pardon was offered. The deadline was set. Any pirate who presented himself and swore an oath of allegiance to the crown before the 5th of September 1718 would receive a full and unconditional pardon for all acts of piracy committed before the 5th of January of that year. The response was overwhelming. Over the following days and weeks, hundreds of pirates came forward to accept the pardon. They signed or marked the register. They swore their oaths. They handed over their articles and their black flags. They became, with the stroke of a bureaucratic pen, lawful subjects of King George I, their crimes erased, their futures theoretically open. Among those who accepted the pardon was Benjamin Hornigold. The founder and architect of the Pirate Republic walked into the governor's makeshift office, took the oath, and accepted a commission from Rogers as a pirate hunter. The man who had built Nassau's outlaw community would now lead expeditions to capture the men who refused to abandon it. The transformation was complete, and its symbolism was devastating. If Hornigold, of all people, had concluded that the Republic's time was over, what hope remained for those who still believed in its survival? Rogers understood that the pardon alone would not hold Nassau. A pardon was a piece of paper. What he needed was a functioning colony, and he needed it before the men who had just surrendered their freedom realized how little they had received in exchange. The problems were immediate and overwhelming. Nassau had no functioning economy beyond piracy. The warehouses along the harbor front were full of stolen goods. But there was no legitimate trade infrastructure, no agricultural base, no export commodity that could sustain a population of several hundred men accustomed to sudden wealth and unlimited rum. The men who had accepted the pardon had been promised their freedom, but freedom to do what? They could not return to the merchant service. Most had outstanding warrants in other colonies. Their skills were those of sea raiders, not farmers or tradesmen. They knew how to board a vessel under fire, how to navigate by stars, how to intimidate a merchant captain into surrender. They did not know how to plant cassava or build a proper house or conduct business within the suffocating framework of colonial law. Rogers attempted to put them to work repairing Nassau's fortifications. Fort Nassau, the crumbling stone structure overlooking the harbor, had been built decades earlier and had deteriorated to the point of near uselessness. Its walls were breached in multiple places. Its cannon, many of them salvaged from shipwrecks, sat on rotting carriages that would collapse at the first firing. Rogers set the pardoned pirates to hauling stone, mixing mortar, and remounting guns, labor that these men considered beneath them and resented with an intensity that grew by the day. The resentment was not merely about the work, it was about what the work represented. These men had lived for years under a system in which their labor produced immediate, tangible rewards divided according to rules they had written themselves. Now they were hauling rocks at the direction of a governor they had not elected for wages that were promised but not yet paid, in service of a fort designed to protect a colonial order that had brutalized them before they became pirates and would, they suspected, brutalize them again once their usefulness was exhausted. Desertions began almost immediately. Men who had accepted the pardon slipped away from Nassau in stolen boats, heading for the outer islands of the Bahamas or the coast of Cuba, where they resumed piracy under new names and new flags. Rogers responded with increasing severity. He organized patrols, imposed curfews, and stationed armed guards at the harbor entrance to prevent unauthorized departures. The settlement that had been built on the principle of free movement was, within weeks of the pardon, beginning to resemble the thing its founders had fled, a controlled environment in which armed authority dictated the movements and labor of common men. Rogers also faced a challenge he had not anticipated: disease. Nassau's sanitation had always been primitive, but the concentration of hundreds of men into work gangs, combined with the disruption of the pirates' previous habits of spending long periods at sea where the open ocean provided a natural separation from accumulated filth, created conditions ideal for epidemic. Fever swept through the settlement in the autumn of 1718. Rogers himself fell gravely ill. Dozens of men died. The work on the fortifications slowed and then stopped as the labor force collapsed. The fever did what Vane's fireship had failed to do. It weakened Rogers's grip on Nassau and created an opening for those who had never truly accepted the pardon to reassert themselves. Men who had sworn oaths of allegiance in July began to talk openly about returning to piracy by October. The governor's authority, never absolute, eroded with each day that passed without pay, without supplies from England, and without any visible improvement in the conditions of daily life. It was in this atmosphere of disillusion and incipient revolt that Rogers made the decision that would define his governorship and send the clearest possible signal about the cost of defiance. In early December 1718, a group of men who had accepted the pardon and then returned to piracy were captured and brought back to Nassau. Rogers convened a trial, the first formal judicial proceeding in the settlement's history. The accused were found guilty. Rogers sentenced 10 of them to death. On the morning of December 10, 1718, 9 men were marched to the ramparts of Fort Nassau and hanged. The 10th had been pardoned at the last moment, a calculated act of mercy designed to demonstrate that the governor's justice included the possibility of clemency as well as death. The bodies were left hanging in public view, twisting slowly in the harbor breeze, visible to every man in Nassau and to the crew of every ship that entered the harbor. The executions were a message, and the message was received. Piracy did not end overnight, but the open defiance that had characterized the weeks following Rogers's arrival diminished sharply. Men who had been talking about returning to the sea went quiet. The work gangs returned to the fortifications with something closer to compliance, if not enthusiasm. Rogers had demonstrated that the pardon was not a blank check. It was a transaction, and the terms were non-negotiable: obey or die. But the hangings also revealed something that Rogers could not afford to acknowledge publicly. The men on those gallows had not been captured in battle. They had not been taken by naval force. They had been betrayed by other pirates. Men who had accepted the pardon and were now cooperating with the governor in exchange for favorable treatment. The Republic of Pirates was not being destroyed from without. It was being dismantled from within by its own members through the same mechanism of self-interest that had built it. The pardon had not merely divided the pirate community. It had turned it against itself. Hornigold was the most prominent of these turncoats and the most effective. Rogers had given him a fast sloop and a crew of pardoned pirates and sent him out to hunt the men he had once led. Hornigold pursued this assignment with a thoroughness that suggested either genuine conversion or a desperate need to prove his loyalty to a new master. He tracked pirate vessels through the Bahamas and along the coast of Cuba. He captured several crews and brought them back to Nassau for trial. He became, in the space of a few months, the thing he had spent a decade fighting against: an agent of the crown, enforcing the empire's authority in waters he had once claimed as his own. The irony was not lost on the men he hunted. To be captured by a naval officer was one thing. To be captured by Benjamin Hornigold, the father of the Republic, was something else entirely. It was a betrayal that struck at the moral foundations of the pirate community, a demonstration that the bonds of shared experience and mutual obligation that had held Nassau together were weaker than the pull of self-preservation. If Hornigold, who had built the Republic, could become its executioner, then the Republic had never been what its inhabitants believed it was. It had been an arrangement of convenience, not a community of conviction, and convenience had shifted. Hornigold would not survive long enough to enjoy whatever rewards his cooperation earned him. In late 1719, his ship was lost in a storm somewhere in the waters between Nassau and the coast of Mexico. No survivors were found. The man who had built the Republic of Pirates and then helped destroy it vanished from the historical record as completely as his creation, leaving behind neither a grave nor a definitive account of his last hours. While Hornigold was hunting pirates in the Bahamas, the man he had mentored was approaching the end of a very different trajectory. Edward Teach had spent the month since his departure from Nassau operating from the coast of North Carolina under the protection of Governor Charles Eden. The arrangement was transparently corrupt. Eden issued Teach a pardon and a legitimate commission to operate as a privateer, despite the fact that England was not at war with anyone. Teach continued to raid merchant vessels, brought his prizes into North Carolina's inlets, and shared the proceeds with the governor and his secretary, Tobias Knight. The local planters and merchants who suffered from Teach's depredations on their trade complained bitterly, but could not challenge a governor who was technically operating within his legal authority to issue commissions. The man who finally ended Blackbeard was not sent by Woodes Rogers or the Admiralty. He was sent by Alexander Spotswood, the governor of Virginia, who had grown tired of Teach's raids on Virginian commerce and decided to act unilaterally. Spotswood commissioned Lieutenant Robert Maynard of the Royal Navy to take 2 sloops south to North Carolina's Ocracoke Inlet, where Teach was known to be anchored, and to capture or kill him. Maynard arrived at Ocracoke on the evening of November 21, 1718. Teach was anchored in the inlet with a single sloop, the Adventure, and a crew of roughly 20 men, while many of them too drunk to fight effectively. The pirate fleet that had once numbered 4 vessels and hundreds of men had dwindled to this: one small ship, a skeleton crew, and a captain whose reign of terror had been reduced to a corrupt partnership with a minor colonial official. The battle that followed on the morning of November 22nd was brief, savage, and utterly unlike the theatrical encounters that had made Blackbeard famous. There were no smoking fuses, no roared threats, no merchant captains surrendering at the sight of a black flag. This was close-quarters combat between armed men who intended to kill each other. Maynard's 2 sloops approached at dawn. Teach cut his anchor cable and attempted to flee through the narrow channel, but the sloops pursued him. As the vessels closed, Teach fired a broadside that swept the deck of Maynard's lead sloop, killing or wounding approximately 20 men, nearly half the crew. Maynard ordered his surviving men below decks, leaving the sloop's deck apparently deserted. Teach, believing the crew had been decimated, pulled alongside and boarded with a dozen men. Maynard's crew surged up from below. The fight devolved into a melee on a blood-slicked deck, cutlasses and pistols at arm's length. Teach and Maynard found each other in the chaos. Teach fired his pistol, missing. Maynard fired his, hitting Teach in the body. Teach swung his cutlass with enough force to snap Maynard's sword blade at the hilt. As Teach drew back for a killing blow, one of Maynard's men slashed him across the throat from behind. Teach continued to fight. The accounts are consistent on this point. Even with his throat laid open, Blackbeard fought on, firing another pistol, swinging his cutlass at anyone within reach, absorbing wounds that would have killed an ordinary man several times over. When it was finally finished, a subsequent examination of Teach's body counted 5 pistol ball wounds and more than 20 cuts from swords and knives. He had died on his feet, fighting, which was exactly how the persona he had spent years constructing demanded he die. Maynard had Teach's head severed and hung from the bowsprit of his sloop as proof of the deed. The headless body, according to legend, was thrown into the inlet and swam 3 times around the ship before sinking. The legend is almost certainly false. But the fact that men felt compelled to invent it tells you everything about the power of the image Teach had created. Blackbeard was 38 years old. He had been an active pirate for approximately 4 years. In that time, he had become the most famous criminal in the Western world, a figure whose name would endure for 3 centuries after his death, while the names of the admirals and governors who opposed him faded into footnotes. His fame was, and remains, wildly disproportionate to his actual impact on the pirate republic. He was neither its founder nor its most successful captain. He was its mask, the face it presented to a world that preferred its villains theatrical and its history simple. The real story of the Republic of Pirates was never about Blackbeard. It was about the system that produced him and the 1,000 anonymous men who built something Blackbeard merely inherited. With Teach dead and Hornigold hunting his former comrades, the resistance to Rogers's authority fell increasingly to Charles Vane, who was still operating in the waters around the Bahamas and the Windward Passage, attacking any vessel he encountered with an indiscriminate fury that had intensified since his flight from Nassau. Vane's career after leaving Nassau was a study in the limits of individual defiance against institutional power. He sailed south along the Caribbean island chain, taking prizes where he could, but finding it increasingly difficult to sell his plunder or resupply his ship. The network of corrupt officials and cooperative merchants that had sustained the pirate economy was collapsing. Governors who had previously turned a blind eye to pirate trade were now under pressure from London to enforce the law. Merchants who had purchased stolen goods were now liable to prosecution. The infrastructure of piracy, the ports, the fences, the corrupt customs officers was being systematically dismantled. And without it, a pirate ship was just a vessel full of stolen goods with nowhere to sell them and no port willing to provide food, water, and repairs. Vane's crew, never the most disciplined group in the pirate fleet, began to fracture under the pressure. In late 1718, the crew encountered a large French warship and Vane refused to engage, judging the target too well armed for a profitable attack. The decision was tactically sound, but politically catastrophic. A pirate captain who refused to fight could be deposed. And Vane's crew voted to remove him from command. The man they elected to replace him was Calico Jack Rackham, who had been serving as Vane's quartermaster. The deposition was a perfect expression of pirate democracy in action, and a bitter one. The system that the pirates had built to protect themselves against tyrannical authority was used to remove the man who had fought hardest to preserve that system. Vane was not executed. He was given a small sloop and a handful of loyal crewmen and set adrift, the pirate equivalent of a political exile. The man who had refused the king's pardon on principle was now adrift in a hostile sea, rejected not by the crown, but by his own people. Vane continued to raid in the Western Caribbean through early 1719, but his circumstances deteriorated rapidly. His small crew made him vulnerable. His reputation for cruelty made it difficult to recruit replacements. In February 1719, a hurricane destroyed his vessel and stranded him on a small, uninhabited island in the Bay of Honduras. He survived there for months, living on fish and rainwater, until a passing ship picked him up. By terrible misfortune, the ship's captain recognized him. Vane was taken to Jamaica in chains. He was tried at Spanish Town, Jamaica in March 1721, more than 2 years after his capture. The trial was brief. The evidence was overwhelming. Vane offered no defense and showed no remorse. He was convicted of piracy and sentenced to death. Charles Vane was hanged at Gallows Point, Port Royal, Jamaica, on March 29, 1721. His body was placed in a gibbet, an iron cage designed to hold a corpse upright, and hung from a post at the entrance to the harbor, where it was left to rot as a warning to anyone who might consider following his example. The gulls picked his bones clean over the following weeks, and the cage swayed in the trade winds, creaking on its chain, a sound that sailors entering Port Royal would have heard before they saw the thing itself. Vane's death closed one chapter of the Republic's aftermath, but the story of Calico Jack Rackham, the man who had replaced him, would write another, and it would be defined not by Rackham himself, but by two figures whose presence aboard his ship would shatter every assumption the 18th century world held about the boundaries of gender. Anne Bonny was born around 1697, probably in County Cork, Ireland, the illegitimate daughter of a lawyer named William Cormac and a servant woman named Mary Brennan. The scandal of her birth forced Cormac to leave Ireland for the colony of South Carolina, where he established himself as a successful plantation owner and raised Anne in relative prosperity. She was, by all accounts, a woman of fierce temperament and physical courage, red-haired and strong-willed, in an era when both qualities were considered defects in a woman. At 16, she married a small-time sailor named James Bonny against her father's wishes, and the couple made their way to Nassau, arriving at approximately the same moment that the pirate republic was reaching its zenith. In Nassau, Anne Bonny found the world she had been looking for without knowing it existed. The rules that constrained women in colonial society, the expectations of deference, domesticity, and silence, he held no force in a settlement governed by men who had themselves rejected every social convention the empire demanded. Bonny abandoned her husband, took up with Rackham, and eventually joined his crew as a full combatant. She did not disguise herself as a man. The crew knew she was a woman. They accepted her because she could fight. And in the pirate meritocracy, that was the only qualification that mattered. Mary Read's path to Rackham's crew was longer and stranger. Born in England around 1685, Read had been disguised as a boy from childhood by her mother, who was attempting to pass her off as a deceased male child in order to collect an inheritance from the child's paternal grandmother. Red grew up male, served as a foot soldier in the British Army in Flanders, and fought in several engagements during the War of the Spanish Succession. She married a fellow soldier, lived briefly as a woman after the war, and then when her husband died, resumed male clothing and went to sea. She ended up in the Caribbean, was captured by pirates, and eventually joined Rackham's crew, where she and Anne Bonny formed a partnership that the historical sources describe with varying degrees of implication, but consistent admiration. Together, Bonny and Red became the most effective fighters on Rackham's ship. The accounts of their final battle in October 1720 when a pirate hunting sloop commissioned by the governor of Jamaica caught Rackham at anchor off the western coast of Jamaica, are consistent in their most damning detail. When the attack came, most of Rackham's crew, including Rackham himself, were too drunk to fight. They hid below decks while Bonnie and Red stood on the open deck and fought the boarding party alone. Anne Bonny reportedly fired into the hold where the male pirates were cowering, screaming at them to come up and fight like men. They did not. The ship was taken. The crew was arrested and transported to Spanish Town for trial. Rackham was convicted and hanged on November 18, 1720. Before his execution, Anne Bonny was permitted to visit him. Her parting words, as recorded by the trial transcripts, were not words of comfort. "Had you fought like a man," she told him, "you need not have been hanged like a dog." It was a verdict as devastating as anything the court could have pronounced, and it came from the woman who had been willing to die beside him if he had been willing to fight. Bonny and Reed were both convicted of piracy, but upon declaring that they were pregnant, received a stay of execution under the common law doctrine that an unborn child could not be punished for its mother's crimes. Mary Reed died in prison in April 1721. Probably of fever. Anne Bonny's fate is genuinely unknown. She vanishes from the historical record after her trial, a disappearance that has generated centuries of speculation and no confirmed answers. Some historians believe her father's wealth and influence secured her release. Others believe she died in prison under a different name. The mystery of her disappearance is, in its way, a fitting end for a woman who had spent her entire life refusing to be contained by the categories others assigned to her. The stories of Bonny and Reed mattered beyond their individual fates because they exposed a contradiction at the heart of the pirate republic's democratic experiment. The articles, the voting, the egalitarian division of plunder, all of these innovations applied, with rare exceptions, only to men. Women were formally barred from most crews. The pirate republic had built a more equitable society than the one it replaced, but its equity had boundaries, and those boundaries tracked the same lines of gender that constrained women throughout the Atlantic world. Bonny and Red did not overthrow those boundaries. They transgressed them individually and spectacularly, and their transgression revealed both the Republic's progressive potential and the limits of that potential. By the time Rackham swung from the gallows at Port Royal, the Republic of Pirates was functionally extinct. Rogers's combination of pardons and prosecutions had broken the community's cohesion. The major captains were dead, captured, or scattered. The harbor at Nassau was now a colonial port, its fortifications repaired, its waterfront increasingly populated by the merchants, tradesmen, and minor colonial officials who constituted the infrastructure of British imperial governance. The black flags that had once filled the harbor were gone, replaced by the merchant ensigns of legitimate trade. Rogers himself was rewarded with ruin. The Crown had provided almost no financial support for his governorship, and Rogers had funded much of the colony's reconstruction from his own pocket. He returned to England in 1721, broken in health and in debt, and was thrown into debtor's prison. The man who had reclaimed Nassau for the British Empire was jailed by the empire he had served. He would eventually be released, return to Nassau as governor a second time, and die there in 1732, still owed money by a crown that had been content to accept his service without compensating it. The irony would not have been lost on the pirates. The Republic of Pirates did not die on a single day or in a single battle. It died the way most revolutionary experiments die, not through dramatic destruction, but through slow erosion, the gradual replacement of one set of habits with another, until the men who had once governed themselves woke up one morning to find that they were governed again and could not quite identify the moment the change had become irreversible. In the years following Rogers's arrival, the transformation of Nassau from pirate capital to colonial outpost proceeded with the grinding inevitability of a tide coming in. The physical settlement changed first. The canvas awnings and palm thatch shelters that had served as taverns and warehouses were replaced one by one. With more permanent structures of coral stone and imported timber, a church was built. A customs house was established. Streets that had been nameless tracks through sand were given names that honored British monarchs and colonial officials who had never set foot on the island. The harbor that had sheltered pirate sloops now sheltered merchant brigs carrying salt, cotton, and the modest agricultural products that New Providence's thin soil could sustain. The human transformation was slower and more painful. The pardoned pirates did not become model colonial subjects overnight. Many never became model colonial subjects at all. They drank, they fought, they regarded the representatives of colonial authority with a simmering contempt that occasionally boiled over into open defiance. They formed a permanent underclass in Nassau's new social order, men whose skills were suited to a world that no longer existed, whose reputations made legitimate employment difficult, and whose experience of freedom made submission intolerable. Some adapted. Former pirates became fishermen, turtle hunters, salvage divers working the wrecks that littered the Bahamian banks. A few leveraged their knowledge of local waters into legitimate careers as harbor pilots, guiding merchant vessels through the treacherous channels they had once used to escape the Royal Navy. Others became what the colonial records euphemistically termed wreckers, men who salvaged cargo from ships that ran aground on the Bahamas' extensive reefs and sandbars. The line between salvage and piracy was often invisible. A wrecker who waited for a ship to founder on a reef was performing a legitimate service. A wrecker who displayed false lights to lure a ship onto a reef was committing murder for profit. The colonial authorities suspected that many of Nassau's former pirates fell into the second category but could rarely prove it. Others did not adapt at all. They drifted away from Nassau in ones and twos, heading for the margins of the colonial world where authority was thin, and a man with a fast sloop and a willingness to use it could still make a living outside the law. Some ended up on the coast of West Africa, where the slave trade created opportunities for men comfortable with violence and moral flexibility. Others scattered through the lesser islands of the Caribbean, living in small settlements that existed below the notice of colonial governors. A few joined the logwood cutters of the Bay of Honduras, communities of men who harvested valuable timber from the coastal forests of Central America and who existed in a legal gray zone that the Spanish considered trespass and the British considered a legitimate commercial enterprise. The pirate diaspora carried fragments of the Republic's culture with it. The articles, the voting, the egalitarian division of profits, these practices did not vanish when Nassau fell. They survived aboard individual ships and in scattered communities for decades. More free. A living memory of the system that had briefly flourished on New Providence. As late as the 1730s, pirate crews operating in the Indian Ocean and along the West African coast were still using articles that bore a recognizable kinship to the ones drafted in Nassau's harbor 2 decades earlier. The Republic of Pirates had been destroyed as a political entity, but as a set of ideas about how men might organize themselves, it proved far more durable than the settlement that had given it form. The question of what the Republic of Pirates meant, what it actually represented in the broader arc of human self-governance, is one that historians, political theorists, and storytellers have been arguing about for 3 centuries. The answers say as much about the people providing them as about the pirates themselves. The first and most enduring interpretation was the one promoted by the British Empire itself. The pirates were criminals, their republic was a den of thieves, and its destruction was an act of civilization triumphing over barbarism. This was the view encoded in the trial transcripts, the execution records, and the official correspondence of colonial governors who treated the pirate problem as a matter of law enforcement rather than political challenge. It was the view that justified the hangings at Fort Nassau, the gibbeting of Charles Vane's body, and the systematic erasure of the pirates' political innovations from the official record. Criminals do not have political philosophies. Thieves do not build democracies. The very idea was, from the imperial perspective, a contradiction in terms. This interpretation dominated for 2 centuries. The pirates of the popular imagination, the figures who populated adventure novels and theatrical productions, and eventually Hollywood films, were romanticized but never politicized. They were dashing rogues or bloodthirsty villains, but they were never democrats. The system they had built, the articles, the voting, the elected captains, the separation of powers between captain and quartermaster, was either ignored or treated as a curiosity, a set of quaint rules that colorful criminals had adopted to manage their affairs. The possibility that these rules represented a genuine political achievement, that illiterate sailors had independently invented democratic institutions that Europe's educated classes were still struggling to theorize, was simply not taken seriously. The revisionist interpretation began to emerge in the late 20th century, driven by historians who approached the pirates not as romantic figures or as criminals, but as members of a laboring class whose political innovations deserved the same analytical rigor applied to other revolutionary movements. Marcus Rediker's work, particularly his 2004 book Villains of All Nations, placed the pirates within the broader context of Atlantic working-class resistance, arguing that their democratic practices were not anomalies, but expressions of a coherent political tradition rooted in the experience of exploitation at sea. Colin Woodard's The Republic of Pirates, published in 2007, synthesized the available sources into a narrative that took the pirates' political achievements seriously without ignoring their violence, their contradictions, or the limits of their egalitarianism. These works did not argue that the pirates were saints. They argued that the pirates were political actors whose innovations emerged from lived experience rather than philosophical theory, and that dismissing those innovations because they were created by criminals was itself a political act. A way of preserving the comfortable fiction that democratic governance could only emerge from the educated, the propertied, and the respectable. The comparison to the American democratic experiment that followed 60 years later is irresistible and instructive, though it must be handled with care. The men who gathered in Philadelphia in 1787 to draft the Constitution of the United States were educated, and propertied gentlemen who had read Locke and Montesquieu and who designed a system of government through deliberate philosophical reasoning. The men who drafted pirate articles in Nassau's harbor were, for the most part, illiterate sailors who had never heard of Locke, and who designed a system of governance through the practical application of principles learned from their own suffering. The two groups arrived at startlingly similar conclusions. Both created systems in which leaders were chosen through election by those they governed. Both established mechanisms for removing leaders who abused their authority. Both divided power between separate offices to prevent its concentration. Both established written codes of law that applied equally to all members of the community. Both created systems for the equitable distribution of collective resources. Both provided for the welfare of individuals injured in the community's service. The differences were equally significant. The American founders restricted political participation to propertied white men. The pirates extended it to every man who signed the articles, regardless of property, literacy, or, in some documented cases, race. The American founders created a system designed to endure indefinitely, with institutions that could evolve and adapt over generations. The pirates created a system designed to function aboard a single ship for the duration of a single voyage, with no mechanism for continuity beyond the crew's continued consent. The American founders explicitly protected the institution of slavery. The pirates' relationship with slavery was inconsistent and contradictory, but their ranks included formerly enslaved Africans who had achieved a degree of freedom and equality that no legal institution in the Western world offered them. The comparison is not intended to argue that pirates were better Democrats than the Founding Fathers. It is intended to argue that democratic impulses are not the exclusive property of educated elites, that the desire for self-governance is not a philosophical abstraction, but a human instinct that emerges wherever people experience the alternative, and that the forms democracy takes are shaped by the specific conditions of the people who create it. The pirates built their democracy from the bottom up, from the experience of the lash and the forecastle, from the knowledge of what it meant to have no voice, no vote, and no share in the wealth their labor produced. They did not need Locke to tell them that government should derive its legitimacy from the consent of the governed. They knew it in their bones and their scars. They did not need Montesquieu to explain the separation of powers. They had watched captains abuse unchecked authority, and had devised a practical solution by dividing command between the captain and the quartermaster. They did not need Adam Smith to theorize about the equitable distribution of economic rewards. They had lived under systems where the fruits of their labor were confiscated by men who did not share their risks and had decided collectively that the arrangement was unacceptable. This is the Republic of Pirates' most enduring legacy, and it is a legacy that the empire that destroyed it would have found profoundly threatening had it been articulated in those terms. The pirates had proven that democracy was not a fragile hothouse flower that required the careful cultivation of philosophers and the protection of propertied gentlemen. It was a weed. It could grow anywhere. It could grow in the poorest soil among the most despised people without institutional support or intellectual scaffolding. All it required was a group of human beings who had experienced tyranny and decided they preferred the alternative. The empire understood this, even if it never said so. The ferocity with which the British Crown moved to destroy the Republic of Pirates was disproportionate to the economic threat the pirates actually posed. The total value of goods stolen by all the pirates of Nassau over the entire period of the Republic's existence was a fraction of a single year's trade revenue from the Sugar Islands. The pirates were a nuisance, not an existential threat to British commerce. What they threatened was something more fundamental: the legitimacy of the hierarchical order that sustained the empire itself. If common sailors could govern themselves, then the hierarchy that placed admirals above captains, captains above officers, and officers above common seamen was not a natural law, but an artificial arrangement maintained by force. If illiterate men could create written codes of law more equitable than anything the British legal system offered, then the legal system's claim to moral authority was undermined. If pirates could create a functional disability insurance system while the Royal Navy left its wounded sailors to beg in the streets, then the Navy's claim to treat its men fairly was exposed as a lie. The Republic of Pirates was dangerous not because it stole ships, but because it demonstrated an alternative. And alternatives, in any system that depends on the governed accepting their subordination as natural and inevitable, are the most dangerous thing in the world. This is why the destruction of Nassau was accompanied by such thorough ideological work. The pirates were not merely defeated, they were delegitimized. The trial transcripts, the execution speeches, the published accounts of pirate cruelty and depravity all served to establish and reinforce the narrative that these men were criminals, motivated by greed and bloodlust, who had created nothing of value, and whose destruction was a straightforward victory of order over chaos. The democratic innovations, the articles, the elections, the egalitarian economics were systematically erased from the official account, or, when they could not be erased, reframed as the peculiar internal rules of a criminal organization rather than the political institutions of a self-governing community. The erasure was remarkably effective. For 250 years, the standard history of Anglo-American democracy traced a line from the Magna Carta through the English Civil War, the Glorious Revolution, and the American founding, without once intersecting the pirate articles drafted in Nassau's harbor. The possibility that democracy had an alternative genealogy, one that ran not through parliaments and constitutional conventions, but through forecastles and harbor front taverns, through the lived experience of the men at the bottom of the social order rather than the theoretical reflections of the men at the top, was simply not entertained. And yet the evidence was always there, preserved in the very trial transcripts that were intended to condemn the pirates. The articles survived because they were entered as evidence of criminal conspiracy. The voting procedures survived because prosecutors cited them as proof that the accused had willingly participated in piracy. The compensation schedules for injured crewmen survived because they were presented as evidence of the pirates' organizational sophistication and therefore their culpability. The empire preserved, inadvertently, the documentary record of the system it had destroyed, filed neatly in the archives of the Admiralty courts, waiting for someone to read it not as a catalog of crimes, but as a constitution written in salt water. The physical traces of the Republic are almost entirely gone. Nassau today is the capital of the modern Bahamas, a city of cruise ship terminals and resort hotels and international banking offices, its harbor dredged to accommodate vessels that would have dwarfed anything the pirates sailed. Fort Nassau has been demolished. The waterfront where pirate captains debated the terms of their articles is buried beneath layers of subsequent development. There is a pirates museum, of course, because the tourism industry has found the pirates more profitable in death than they ever were in life. But the museum traffics in the romance of piracy rather than its politics. Cutlasses and cannon and Jolly Roger flags, not articles of governance and disability compensation schedules. The Whydah Galley, Black Sam Bellamy's flagship, remains the most tangible connection to the Republic's material reality. The artifacts recovered from its wreck off Cape Cod include not only gold and silver, but the mundane objects of daily life aboard a pirate vessel. Navigation instruments, medical equipment, cooking utensils, personal possessions. Among the items recovered was a small brass pistol, the kind a man might carry in his waistband rather than in a holster, a personal weapon rather than a weapon of war. There were buttons made of bone and pewter, and some of them carved with designs that suggest their owners had spent long hours at sea with nothing but a knife and time. There were fragments of cloth, the remnants of clothing that was neither the rags of destitution nor the finery of stolen wealth, but the practical garments of working men. The wreck told the story that the trial transcripts could not, that the pirates of Nassau were beneath their fearsome reputations and their black flags ordinary people. They cooked meals. They mended their clothes. They carried small personal objects that mattered to them for reasons that had nothing to do with their monetary value. They were human beings who had built a community, however imperfect, and who had died in the same cold, dark, chaotic waters that claimed thousands of other sailors whose names no one remembers. The Republic lasted, depending on how you count, somewhere between 8 and 12 years. If you date its beginning to the collapse of royal authority on New Providence around 1706 and its end to Roger's arrival in 1718, that is 12 years. If you date its beginning to the post-Treaty of Utrecht influx of 1714 and its end to the mass pardons and executions of 1718 and 1719, that is 4 or 5 years. If you measure not the Republic's formal existence, but the period during which its institutions functioned at full capacity, with elected captains, ratified articles, and coordinated operations across the Atlantic, the window narrows further still to perhaps 3 years of genuine self-governance. 3 years, 1,000 men. An island that no empire wanted, and from these materials, they built something that would not appear again in the Western Hemisphere for 6 decades, when a group of men in Philadelphia, most of them far wealthier, and all of them far more educated than any pirate who ever sailed from Nassau, would sit down to create a system of government based on principles that a generation of illiterate sailors had already tested, refined, and lived by on the decks of stolen ships. The pirates did not know they were making history. They did not think of themselves as political pioneers. They thought of themselves as men who had been given a raw deal by the world and who had decided collectively to cut a better one. They drank too much. They were capable of cruelty. They inflicted suffering on people who had done nothing to deserve it. They were not heroes in any conventional sense of the word. But they were, in the most literal and practical sense, self-governing citizens of a republic they had built with their own hands. They voted for their leaders. They wrote their own laws. They divided their wealth according to rules they had agreed upon collectively. They took care of their injured. They held their leaders accountable. They did all of this in an era when the vast majority of human beings on Earth lived under systems that granted them none of these rights. And they did it without any of the advantages, the education, the wealth, the institutional support that political theorists have always insisted are prerequisites for democratic self-governance. The Republic of Pirates was not a paradise. It was not even, by any rigorous definition, a republic in the classical sense. It had no territory beyond a harbor. It had no constitution beyond the separate articles of individual crews. It had no mechanism for perpetuating itself beyond the lifetime of its founding generation. It was fragile, contradictory, violent, and brief. But it was real. It happened. 1,000 men who had been treated as less than human by the most powerful empire on earth built a community where they governed themselves. And that community worked well enough to terrify the empire into dispatching a governor, a squadron, and a royal pardon to destroy it. The empire won, as empires generally do. The pirates hanged or accepted pardons and lived out diminished lives in the margins of the colonial world, or vanished into the ocean that had been both their workplace and their home. What they left behind was not a government or a territory or an institution. What they left behind was a proof of concept. The demonstration that ordinary people, given the opportunity, will organize themselves along lines that are recognizably democratic, not because they have been taught democratic theory, but because democracy is what emerges when human beings who have experienced its absence are free to build something better. The waves still wash over the sandbars at the entrance to Nassau's harbor, the same sandbars that once protected a fleet of pirate sloops from the warships of the Royal Navy. The water is the same impossible turquoise, the light the same blinding white. The trade winds the same steady breath from the southeast that filled the sails of stolen ships 300 years ago. The harbor is deeper now, dredged for cruise ships, and the shoreline is armored with concrete seawalls and dotted with the pastel facades of colonial era buildings that post-date the Republic by a generation or more. Nothing visible remains of the settlement that Benjamin Hornigold built and Woodes Rogers dismantled. But the idea remains. The stubborn, inconvenient, historically documented fact that a group of the most marginalized, most brutalized, most despised people in the Atlantic world looked at the system that governed them, rejected it, and built something better. Something imperfect, something temporary, something that the powerful found so threatening that they mobilized an empire to destroy it, and then spent 3 centuries pretending it had never existed. The pirates of Nassau would not have understood the word democracy. Most of them could not have spelled it. But they knew what it felt like to have a voice, to cast a vote, to see their labor rewarded fairly, to hold their leaders accountable, and to live under laws they had written themselves. They knew these things not as abstractions, but as daily realities. And when those realities were taken from them, they knew exactly what they had lost. In the end, the Republic of Pirates matters not because it succeeded, but because it existed at all, because it proved that the impulse towards self-governance is not a product of education or wealth or philosophical sophistication, but something far more fundamental, something that lives in the space between what human beings endure and what they believe they deserve. The pirates found that space on a sun-blasted island in the Bahamas, in a harbor protected by sandbars and governed by articles written in salt-stained ink. They held it for a handful of years. And then the empire came, and the pardons were offered, and the gallows were built, and the flags came down. But the idea did not hang. Ideas never do. They drift, like the smoke from Blackbeard's slow-burning fuses, through the generations that follow, changing shape but never quite dissipating until someone else, in some other place, breathing air that carries no trace of gunpowder or Caribbean salt, picks up the thread and begins again. 60 years after the last pirate flag was lowered over Nassau's harbor, a group of men in a sweltering room in Philadelphia would pick up exactly that thread. They would call what they built a republic. They would call its foundational document a constitution. They would call its core principles self-evident truths. They would not mention the pirates. They did not need to. The pirates had already proven that the thing could be done. The only question left was whether it could be made to last. That question, whether it could be made to last, was one the pirates themselves had confronted in their own way, long before the Republic's final days. And the answer they discovered was not the one that the romantic imagination prefers. The Republic of Pirates did not fall because the British Empire overwhelmed it with superior force. It fell because the contradictions within the pirate community itself made it vulnerable to exactly the kind of fracture that Woodes Rogers exploited. The Empire provided the pressure. The cracks were already there. To understand those cracks, you have to look beneath the democratic surface of the pirate articles and examine the Republic as it actually functioned in its final years, not as a unified polity of free men standing shoulder to shoulder against imperial tyranny, but as a collection of competing interests, personal ambitions, and irreconcilable visions of what the community was supposed to be. The Republic's strength, that it was built from the bottom up by men who shared a common experience of exploitation, was also its fatal weakness. These men agreed on what they were against. They never fully agreed on what they were for. The fault line ran through the center of every decision the community faced, and it can be described simply. Was the Republic of Pirates a permanent alternative to the imperial order? Or was it a temporary arrangement designed to enrich its members until something better came along? For men like Charles Vane, the answer was unambiguous. Piracy was not a career. It was a political stance. The Republic was not a base of operations. It was a sovereign community, and its sovereignty was worth defending with the same ferocity that any nation would bring to the defense of its territory. Vane's refusal to accept the pardon was not stubbornness or recklessness. It was consistency. He had rejected the legitimacy of the British Crown's authority over his life, and accepting a pardon would have meant acknowledging that authority, conceding that his freedom had been a temporary indulgence that the Crown could revoke at its pleasure. For Vane, the Republic was the point. Everything else, the plunder, the ships, the rum, was incidental. For men like Hornigold, the answer was equally clear but diametrically opposed. The Republic was a means to an end. It existed because the conditions that created it, the end of the war, the collapse of privateering, the absence of royal authority on New Providence, made it possible and profitable. When those conditions changed, when the Crown reasserted itself and the cost of piracy began to exceed its rewards, the rational response was to adapt. Hornigold's acceptance of the pardon and his subsequent career as a pirate hunter were not betrayals of principle. They were the actions of a pragmatist who had never invested the Republic with the ideological significance that Vane attributed to it. For Hornigold, piracy had always been a business conducted in a favorable regulatory environment. When the regulations changed, so did the business. Between these two poles stood the majority of Nassau's pirates, men who had never articulated a coherent political philosophy and did not need one, who had come to New Providence because it offered them freedom, wealth, and dignity, and who would stay exactly as long as it continued to offer those things. These men were neither ideologues nor cynics. They were working people making practical calculations about their own survival. And when Rogers arrived with his pardons in one hand and his gallows in the other, their calculations shifted. This is the dynamic that historians of revolution would recognize instantly. Every revolutionary movement contains the same three groups: the true believers who would rather die than compromise, the pragmatists who will compromise the moment the cost-benefit analysis changes, and the silent majority who follow whichever group appears to be winning. The Republic of Pirates was no different, and like every revolutionary movement that fails to institutionalize itself, to create structures capable of surviving the loss of its founding generation, the Republic was undone not by the strength of its enemies, but by the inability of its members to resolve their internal contradictions before those enemies arrived. The specific mechanism of dissolution was economic, and it deserves closer examination than romantic accounts of pirate democracy typically provide. The pirate economy was, by its nature, extractive. It produced nothing. It depended entirely on the capture and redistribution of wealth created by others. This was not a moral failing unique to pirates. It was a structural characteristic of their enterprise, and it imposed constraints that no amount of democratic governance could overcome. The most important constraint was logistical. A pirate ship consumed resources at a prodigious rate. Gunpowder, shot, rope, sailcloth, tar, provisions for crews that could number over 100 men. These could not be manufactured aboard ship or on the thin soil of New Providence. They had to be purchased, and purchasing them required access to markets that were increasingly hostile to pirate trade. The fences and corrupt officials who had once facilitated the exchange of stolen goods for necessary supplies were, by 1717, under growing pressure from London to cease their cooperation. Governors who had previously profited from pirate commerce were being replaced by men like Rogers, whose instructions explicitly prohibited it. The network of clandestine trade that had sustained the pirate economy was contracting, and each contraction made the next raid less profitable, the next reprovisioning more difficult, and the next voyage more dangerous. The result was a vicious cycle. As the pirate economy became less sustainable, crews had to range farther from Nassau to find targets, which increased the time and resources spent on each voyage, which reduced the per-man return on plunder, which made piracy less attractive relative to the pardon Rogers was offering, which thinned the ranks of available crewmen, which further reduced the Republic's collective strength. The economic engine that had powered Nassau's growth was, by the time Rogers arrived, already sputtering. There was a deeper problem still. The pirate articles, for all their democratic innovations, contained no mechanism for collective investment or long-term economic planning. Every voyage ended with a complete distribution of plunder. There was no common fund, no shared treasury, no pool of capital that could be used to maintain the harbor's infrastructure, provision the community during lean periods, or finance collective defense. Each crew was a self-contained economic unit. When it returned to port and divided its spoils, the economic relationship between its members dissolved until the next voyage began. The Republic was, in economic terms, a collection of temporary partnerships operating from a shared location, not an integrated community with a sustainable economic base. This meant that Nassau could not build the institutions that a permanent community required. There was no tax revenue to fund public works. There was no mechanism for compelling contributions to collective defense beyond voluntary cooperation among captains, cooperation that was contingent on personal relationships and shared short-term interests. When Rogers arrived and the question of collective resistance arose, there was no institutional structure capable of organizing it. Each captain made his own calculation. Each crew voted independently. The result was not a unified response, but a scatter pattern of individual decisions, exactly as Rogers had predicted. The comparison to early American governance is, again, instructive. The Articles of Confederation, the first Constitution of the United States, suffered from many of the same structural weaknesses: a central government that could not tax, states that functioned as independent entities, no mechanism for compelling collective action. The American founders eventually solved these problems by replacing the Articles with the Constitution, which created a stronger central authority capable of enforcing collective decisions. The pirates of Nassau never had the opportunity to make that transition. Their republic was destroyed before it could evolve the institutions necessary for its own survival. Whether it could have evolved those institutions, whether a community of pirates could have developed a sustainable economy, a taxation system, and a centralized governance structure is one of the great counterfactual questions of Atlantic history. The answer is almost certainly no. The pirate economy was inherently parasitic, and parasitic economies do not evolve into self-sustaining ones without a fundamental transformation of their productive base. The pirates would have had to stop being pirates, which would have meant abandoning the very identity that held the community together. The Republic of Pirates was, in this sense, a political achievement built on an economic impossibility, and the impossibility guaranteed that the achievement would be temporary. But temporary does not mean insignificant. The fact that the Republic could not have lasted forever does not diminish what it accomplished during the years it existed. The Pirate Articles remain a remarkable document of political innovation. The electoral system aboard pirate ships remains a genuine example of democratic practice emerging from lived experience rather than theoretical reasoning. The compensation schedules for injured crewmen remain an early instance of the welfare state principle that would not be formally adopted by any national government for another 2 centuries. These achievements are not diminished by the Republic's economic unsustainability any more than the achievements of the Paris Commune are diminished by its 72-day duration, or the achievements of Reconstruction are diminished by its eventual abandonment. What the economic analysis reveals is not that the pirates failed, but that they were attempting something unprecedented with tools that were inadequate to the task. They were trying to build a permanent community on the foundation of a temporary economic activity, and the mismatch between the ambition and the means guaranteed a short lifespan. The wonder is not that the Republic fell, but that it functioned as well as it did for as long as it did. The racial dynamics of the Republic present a similarly complicated picture, one that resists both the romantic interpretation in which the pirates were colorblind egalitarians and the dismissive interpretation in which they were merely criminals who exploited enslaved people as readily as any planter. The documentary evidence is fragmentary and contradictory, but several facts are reasonably well established. First, a significant number of formerly enslaved Africans served aboard pirate vessels, and some of them achieved positions of genuine authority. The crew of Blackbeard's Queen Anne's Revenge included approximately 60 black men, roughly a third of the total complement. And contemporary accounts suggest that at least some of them were armed, fought in engagements, and received shares of plunder comparable to those of white crewmen. The Whydah Galley's crew, recovered from the wreck off Cape Cod, included men of African descent who were buried in the same mass grave as their white crewmates. Their remains commingled in a way that the rigidly segregated society of colonial Massachusetts would never have permitted for living men. Second, the pirate articles themselves were, in their written form, race neutral. They specified shares for every man who signed them, without racial qualification. This does not prove that racial equality was practiced. Written law and lived reality are rarely identical in pirate communities or anywhere else. But the absence of explicit racial hierarchy in the articles is notable in an era when every other institution in the Atlantic world, from churches to courts to commercial enterprises, was organized around the presumption of white supremacy. Third, and complicating the picture considerably, pirates were active participants in the slave trade. Many of the vessels they captured were slave ships, and the cargo of enslaved human beings aboard those ships was treated, in some documented cases, as plunder to be divided like any other commodity. Some pirate crews forcibly conscripted enslaved Africans from captured vessels, pressing them into service as laborers or sailors without the pretense of consent that the pirate articles provided to white crewmen. The Republic of Pirates existed within an Atlantic economy built on enslaved labor, and its members were neither immune to nor innocent of the system's moral catastrophe. The truth, insofar as it can be recovered from sources that are incomplete and often contradictory, appears to be that the pirate community's racial practices varied widely from crew to crew and captain to captain. Some crews integrated black sailors as full members with equal rights. Others treated them as property. Most probably fell somewhere in between, extending some degree of practical equality to black crewmen while maintaining informal hierarchies that reflected the racial assumptions of the broader culture. The Republic of Pirates was more racially progressive than the society it rejected, but it was not a racial utopia. It was a community of human beings living within the constraints of their historical moment. Sin hof mai. And their historical moment was one in which the enslavement of Africans was so deeply normalized that even men who had rejected virtually every other social convention of their era could not entirely escape its logic. This complexity is essential to any honest assessment of the Republic's legacy. The temptation, particularly in the 21st century, is to either celebrate the pirates as proto-abolitionists or condemn them as hypocrites. Both responses flatten a reality that was irreducibly complicated. The Republic of Pirates was a place where a formerly enslaved man could, in some circumstances, vote on the election of his captain and receive an equal share of plunder, and also a place where enslaved people were bought, sold, and exploited. These facts coexist not because the pirates were uniquely contradictory, but because all revolutionary movements are contradictory, because the work of building a more just society is always incomplete, always compromised by the very injustices it seeks to overcome. The American Republic, which would declare all men created equal while constitutionally protecting slavery, would demonstrate the same contradiction on a vastly larger scale 6 decades later. The gender dynamics of the Republic have already been glimpsed through the stories of Anne Bonny and Mary Read, but those stories, extraordinary as they are, can obscure the broader reality. The pirate articles explicitly prohibited women from most ships. The few women who served aboard pirate vessels did so as exceptions that tested but did not break the rule. The pirate democracy was, overwhelmingly, a democracy of men, and its exclusion of women mirrored the exclusion practiced by every other political community in the Western world. What made Bonny and Reed significant was not that they overthrew this exclusion, but that they exposed its arbitrariness. The pirate articles excluded women on the grounds that their presence would generate sexual competition and thereby threaten crew cohesion. The assumption was that women were a disruptive force that needed to be managed through exclusion. Bonny and Reed demonstrated that women could be not merely non-disruptive but militarily superior to the men who sought to exclude them. Their stand on the deck of Rackham's ship, fighting while the male crew hid below, was not just an act of personal courage. It was an empirical refutation of the premise that justified their exclusion. The pirate community did not learn from this demonstration. There is no evidence that the example of Bonny and Reed led to any broader acceptance of women aboard pirate ships. The exclusion continued, and enforced by the same articles that in every other respect represented a progressive departure from the norms of the surrounding society. The Republic of Pirates could imagine a world without kings, without class hierarchy, without the exploitation of working men by propertied elites, but it could not or would not imagine a world without the subordination of women. The boundary of its radicalism stopped at the line of gender, as so many revolutionary movements' boundaries would stop at the same line in the centuries that followed. There is one final dimension of the Republic's legacy that deserves examination, and it is perhaps the most enduring: the cultural legacy. The transformation of the pirates of Nassau from historical figures into mythological ones, and the uses to which that mythology has been put in the 3 centuries since the Republic's fall. The process began almost immediately. Captain Charles Johnson's A General History of the Pirates, published just 6 years after Rogers's arrival in Nassau, was not a work of sober historical analysis. It was a bestseller written to entertain, and it established the template for pirate narratives that would dominate Western popular culture for the next 300 years. Johnson, whoever he was, understood that the reading public was not interested in the political innovations of pirate governance or the economic structures of the pirate community. They wanted adventure, danger, larger-than-life characters, and the vicarious thrill of lawlessness experienced from the safety of a drawing room chair. The General History delivered all of this with considerable literary skill. It gave the world Blackbeard's smoking beard, Charles Vane's Defiance, the romance of Anne Bonny and Mary Read, and a gallery of pirate portraits that combined genuine historical detail with embellishment, invention, and the irresistible pull of a good story. It also, crucially, depoliticized the pirates. By framing them as colorful individuals rather than as members of a political community, Johnson stripped the pirate narrative of its most subversive content. The democratic practices, the egalitarian economics, the challenge to hierarchical authority, these elements were present in the text but subordinated to the adventure narrative that surrounded them. The reader came away thrilled, entertained, and fundamentally untroubled. The pirates were dashing rogues, not political revolutionaries. Their story was an adventure, not a critique of the social order. This depoliticization was reinforced by every subsequent retelling. Robert Louis Stevenson's Treasure Island, published in 1883, fixed the pirate in the Western imagination as a figure of romantic adventure, complete with treasure maps, buried gold parrots, and wooden legs. The novel drew heavily on Johnson's general history but stripped away even the vestigial political content that Johnson had preserved. Long John Silver was a villain and a scoundrel, but he was not a Democrat. His mutiny was motivated by greed, not by a rejection of hierarchical authority. The world Stevenson created was thrilling but politically inert, a fantasy of lawlessness that offered no challenge to the reader's assumptions about how the world should be organized. The 20th century amplified the pattern. Hollywood discovered pirates and found them ideally suited to the demands of adventure cinema. Errol Flynn swashbuckled his way through a series of films in the 1930s and 1940s that established the visual vocabulary of pirate movies. The billowing sails, the sword fights, the swinging from rigging, and that reduced the pirate to a handsome adventurer whose rebellion against authority was personal and romantic rather than political and structural. The pirates of Hollywood were rebels without a cause, individual nonconformists whose defiance of the law was charming rather than threatening because it was disconnected from any systemic critique of the law's injustice. The Disney franchise that began with Pirates of the Caribbean in 2003 brought the depoliticization to its logical endpoint. Captain Jack Sparrow, as portrayed by Johnny Depp, was a pirate stripped of every quality that had made actual pirates politically dangerous. He was eccentric, charming, and incompetent. His rebellion was aesthetic rather than substantive. He was a lifestyle brand masquerading as a revolutionary, all attitude and no analysis. The enormous commercial success of the franchise demonstrated the cultural appetite for the pirate image while simultaneously demonstrating the cultural refusal to engage with the pirate reality. The real pirates of Nassau would have recognized something bitterly familiar in this process. They had spent their lives being exploited by systems that profited from their labor while denying them any share of the value they created. In death, the exploitation continued. Their stories were harvested for entertainment value. Their images were reproduced on merchandise. Their names were attached to theme park rides and fast food promotions, and the profits flowed to corporations whose organizational structures, with their executive compensation packages and their minimum wage workers, bore a closer resemblance to the merchant ships the pirates had plundered than to the democratic vessels the pirates had sailed. The cultural mythology served the same function as the trial transcripts. It rendered the pirates harmless. An adventure story is not a threat to the social order. A cartoon pirate on a cereal box is not a challenge to hierarchical authority. By transforming the pirates from political actors into entertainment properties, the culture that descended from the empire that destroyed them completed the work of delegitimization that the hangings at Fort Nassau had begun. The pirates were not merely defeated. They were absorbed, digested, and excreted as commodity. Their revolutionary content neutralized. Their democratic innovations forgotten. Their challenge to the structure of power converted into profit for the very kind of power structure they had challenged. This is not a conspiracy. It is a cultural process, and it operates on the same principles as all cultural processes. The stories that survive are the stories that serve the needs of the people telling them, and the needs of a hierarchical society are not served by stories about successful alternatives to hierarchy. The pirate adventure story survived because it was entertaining and unthreatening. The pirate democracy story did not survive because it was neither. The recovery of that story, the slow, painstaking work of historians like Rediker and Woodard, represents something more than academic correction. It represents the return of a suppressed alternative, the reintroduction into public consciousness of the documented fact that ordinary people, acting without philosophical guidance or institutional support, built a democratic community that functioned effectively and that was destroyed not because it failed, but because it succeeded well enough to threaten the interests of the powerful. The ships that carried the pirates of Nassau are gone, rotted to nothing on the ocean floor, or broken up for timber in ports whose names have been forgotten. The harbor that sheltered them has been transformed beyond recognition. The men themselves have been dead for 3 centuries, their bones scattered across the seabed of the Atlantic, their graves unmarked, their individual stories largely unrecoverable. But the articles survive, copied into trial transcripts, reproduced in Johnson's General History, preserved in the archives of Admiralty courts that intended them as evidence of criminality. The pirate articles remain available to anyone who cares to read them. They are not elegant documents. They are blunt, practical, and concerned with the immediate needs of men living dangerous lives in confined spaces. They address the distribution of food and the settlement of quarrels and the compensation of injuries with the same matter-of-fact directness that a modern employee handbook might bring to vacation policy and workplace safety, but read them carefully. Or read them in the context of the world that produced them, a world of floggings and impressment and unpaid wages and class-based contempt for the men who did the dangerous work that made the empire's wealth possible. Read them as the words of men who had experienced the alternative to self-governance and found it intolerable. Read them as the founding documents of a community that existed for a handful of years on an island that no one wanted and that nevertheless produced, from the raw material of shared suffering and practical necessity, a system of government more responsive, more equitable, and more accountable than anything the civilized world had yet achieved. And then consider what that means, not for the pirates, who are beyond the reach of any reassessment, but for the question they answered without knowing they were being asked, the question of whether democracy requires prerequisites, whether it demands education, wealth, institutional tradition, philosophical sophistication, or any of the other qualities that the powerful have always insisted upon as conditions for permitting the powerless to govern themselves. The pirates' answer was no. Democracy requires only the desire for it, and the desire arises naturally, inevitably, in any group of human beings who have experienced what happens when it is absent. The trade winds still blow from the southeast across the Bahamas, the same winds that filled the sails of pirate sloops 300 years ago. They carry no memory of the men who used them, no echo of the debates conducted in harbor front taverns, no trace of the votes cast on rolling decks. The wind does not remember, but the documents do. And in the documents, if you know where to look, you can still hear the voices of men who were told they were nothing, who were treated as less than human, who were beaten and starved and exploited and discarded, and who responded by building from nothing a world in which they were citizens. The story of that world's golden age, and of the individual captains whose brilliance and brutality defined it, has been told. The story of its destruction has been told. What remains to be told is the story of its afterlife, the ways in which the Republic's principles survived its physical annihilation and resurfaced in contexts its founders could never have imagined. Because the most remarkable thing about the Republic of Pirates is not that it existed. It is that it refused to stay dead. The afterlife of the Republic began in the waters off the West African coast, in the swampy estuaries of Madagascar, and along the shipping lanes of the Indian Ocean, carried there by men who had sailed from Nassau before Rogers arrived or who had slipped away in the months after the pardons, men who refused to accept that the experiment was over simply because one harbor had been lost. The most significant of these carriers was Bartholomew Roberts, known to his contemporaries as Blackbeard, a Welshman who never set foot in Nassau during its golden age but who inherited its traditions so completely that his career constitutes the Republic's most fully realized expression in exile. Roberts was captured from a slave ship off the coast of Ghana in June 1719 by a pirate crew led by Howell Davis, in another Welshman who had been operating from the West African coast since accepting and then violating one of Rogers's pardons. When Davis was killed in an ambush on the island of Principe weeks later, the crew elected Roberts as their new captain. Roberts had been aboard the pirate vessel for barely 6 weeks. He had not sought command. He had not campaigned for it. The crew chose him because they had observed in those 6 weeks that he possessed the qualities the pirate system was designed to select for: tactical intelligence, personal courage, navigational skill, and the temperament to lead without tyrannizing. The election was conducted according to the same procedures that had governed captaincy votes in Nassau's harbor. Every man had a voice. The majority decided, and the man they chose would serve at their pleasure, irremovable by the same mechanism that had elevated him. Roberts accepted the command with a phrase that the historical record preserved, and that encapsulated the pirate philosophy as precisely as anything Bellamy had ever said. "Since I have dipped my hands in muddy water and must be a pirate," he told the crew, "it is better being a commander than a common man." It was not idealism. It was pragmatism expressed with clarity, and it reflected the calculation that every pirate made. If the world offered only bad options, choose the bad option that came with autonomy and a fair share of the proceeds. Roberts would go on to become the most successful pirate of the entire Golden Age, capturing over 400 vessels in a career that lasted just 3 years, operating under articles that were the most detailed and the most equitable of any that survive in the historical record. Roberts's articles, which were entered into evidence at the mass trial of his crew after his death, and thus preserved with unusual completeness, extended the Nassau model in ways that revealed how the pirate legal tradition was evolving even as its geographic center was destroyed. Article 1 established the familiar democratic framework. Every man had a vote in affairs of moment, equal title to fresh provisions and strong liquors at any time seized, and liberty to use them at pleasure unless a scarcity made it necessary for the good of all to vote a retrenchment. The language was precise. The principle was absolute. New resources belonged to the collective and were distributed equally unless collective necessity dictated otherwise, and the determination of necessity was made by collective vote, not by executive decree. Article 2 addressed the division of plunder with the same compressed ratio that Nassau's crews had established. Captain 2 shares, master, mate, gunner, and boatswain 1.5 shares, other officers 1.25, all others 1 share. Roberts's crew had explicitly debated whether the captain's premium should be larger and had rejected the proposal. 2-to-1 was the maximum differential the democratic culture would tolerate. The captain bore greater responsibility and therefore received greater compensation. But the gap between highest and lowest was held to a ratio that would astonish the board of any modern corporation. Article 3 addressed the matter that had been the pirate community's most innovative contribution to the history of social welfare. Compensation for injuries was specified with the same precision that earlier articles had established, but Roberts's version added a provision that was new. A common fund was maintained from which injured men could draw their compensation immediately without waiting for the next division of plunder. The fund was replenished from the first proceeds of each successful capture, before any individual shares were calculated. The welfare of the injured took precedence over the profits of the healthy. It was the insurance principle, refined through practice and encoded in written law by men who had never heard the word actuarial. Roberts's articles also contained provisions that reflected the specific challenges of operating far from Nassau's supportive community. Article 5 prohibited gambling aboard ship for money, a rule common to most pirate articles but one whose enforcement became more critical on long voyages where boredom and close quarters amplified every source of conflict. Article 6 required every man to keep his weapons clean and ready for service at all times, a military discipline imposed not by command authority but by collective agreement. Article 9 specified that musicians were entitled to rest on the Sabbath but could be required to play on all other days. A detail that reveals the importance of music to the morale of men spending months at sea and the pirate community's characteristically practical approach to managing that morale. Most remarkably, Article 11 addressed desertion in terms that exposed the social contract at the heart of the pirate enterprise. Any man who wished to leave the crew was free to do so, provided he had contributed his fair share to the common expenses and had not accumulated debts to his crewmates. The pirate community was voluntary. No man could be compelled to remain against his will, but the freedom to leave was balanced by the obligation to have contributed while present. The social contract was explicit, bilateral, and enforced by collective norms rather than by coercion. A man who took more than he gave would find himself unwelcome on any future crew, because reputation traveled fast in the pirate world, and the community's memory was long. Roberts enforced these articles with a discipline that surprised his contemporaries and has puzzled historians who expect pirates to have been ungovernable. He was a teetotaler in a community of legendary drinkers preferring tea to rum, and he maintained a personal standard of dress and comportment that set him apart from the slovenly image that pirate mythology would later promote. He was also, by the accounts of captured sailors who encountered him, courteous to prisoners, efficient in his plundering, and genuinely committed to the democratic governance of his ship. He presided over crew votes with a formality that approached judicial proceeding. He submitted his tactical decisions to collective review after every engagement. He accepted criticism from common sailors with a patience that would have been unthinkable aboard a naval vessel. He was not for all that a gentleman. Roberts could be ruthless when he judged ruthlessness necessary, and his definition of necessity was calibrated to the survival of his crew rather than to any abstract moral principle. He burned slave ships whose captains resisted capture. He tortured a Portuguese governor who had been complicit in the death of one of his crewmen. He hanged a deserter from the yardarm as a demonstration that the social contract cut both ways. These acts were not inconsistent with the democratic system. They were products of it. The crew had authorized violence through their articles and their votes, and the captain executed the collective will. The violence was not arbitrary. It was deliberate, purposeful, and sanctioned by the same democratic process that governed the distribution of plunder and the election of officers. Roberts's 3-year career from 1719 to 1722 represented the high watermark of pirate operational capability. His fleet ranged from the coast of Brazil to Newfoundland to the Gulf of Guinea, disrupting trade across 3 continents and forcing the Royal Navy to commit significant resources to his pursuit. At the peak of his power, he commanded 4 vessels and several hundred men, and the mere rumor of his presence in a particular stretch of ocean was sufficient to halt merchant shipping for weeks. But Roberts's career also demonstrated the structural limitations that had doomed the Nassau Republic, and that would doom every subsequent attempt to sustain pirate communities outside of a defensible permanent base. Without Nassau's harbor, Roberts had no safe port for repairs, no reliable market for stolen goods, and no fixed community to provide replacement crewmen when disease, desertion, and battle attrited his ranks. He was forced to careen his ships on exposed beaches, where they were vulnerable to surprise attack. He traded stolen goods through increasingly unreliable intermediaries who cheated him as often as they dealt fairly. He recruited from captured merchant vessels, accepting men who joined under duress and whose loyalty was uncertain. The logistical problems compounded. Roberts's fleet consumed gunpowder, cordage, and sailcloth, and provisions at a rate that required near constant capture of prizes, not for their cargo value but for their naval stores. Voyages that should have been profitable became exercises in survival, with the crew spending more energy maintaining their ships than acquiring wealth. The glamour of pirate life, such as it was, eroded under the pressure of chronic supply shortage, and the democratic governance that functioned well when morale was high became increasingly fractious as conditions deteriorated. Roberts was killed on February 10, 1722, in an engagement with HMS Swallow off Cape Lopez in present-day Gabon. A broadside of grape shot struck him in the throat as he stood on his quarterdeck, dressed in a crimson damask waistcoat and a hat with a red feather, the most conspicuous figure on the ship. Not as a captain, who led from the front was expected to be. He died instantly. His crew, honoring a standing order, threw his body overboard before the enemy could capture it. The sea received him and left no trace. The crew of the Royal Fortune, Roberts's flagship, fought on briefly and then surrendered. 272 men were captured and transported to Cape Coast Castle, the British slave-trading fort on the coast of Ghana, where they were tried in the largest mass pirate trial in history. The trial lasted a month. 169 men were acquitted or pardoned, 54 were condemned to death, 52 of those were hanged, their bodies displayed along the coast as warnings. The remaining men received lesser sentences, including imprisonment and forced labor in the very slave-trading forts that many of them had attacked during their careers. The trial transcripts, preserved in meticulous detail by the Admiralty Court, constitute the most complete documentary record of a pirate crew's internal organization ever produced. They include the full text of Roberts's articles, testimony about the voting procedures and governance structures aboard his ships, and individual accounts from crewmen describing how decisions were made, disputes were settled, and plunder was divided. The court intended this material as evidence of criminal conspiracy. It is, in fact, the most detailed constitution of a pirate democracy that survives. A document as revealing of 18th century working-class political thought as any pamphlet published in London or Philadelphia. Robert's death and the mass trial at Cape Coast Castle are conventionally regarded as the end of the golden age of piracy. The date is somewhat arbitrary, as scattered pirate crews continued to operate in various parts of the Atlantic for years afterward. But the scale and ambition of pirate operations declined sharply after 1722. The Royal Navy's reach had extended to every major shipping lane. The network of corrupt officials and cooperative merchants that had sustained the pirate economy was effectively destroyed. The pardons offered by Rogers and by governors in other colonies had siphoned off the pragmatists, and the ideologues, men like Vane and Roberts, had been killed or captured. The conditions that had made the Republic possible, the surplus of skilled unemployed sailors, the absence of effective naval patrols, the willingness of colonial officials to tolerate pirate trade had all reversed. The window had closed, but the principles survived the practitioners in ways that were sometimes direct and sometimes diffuse, sometimes documented and sometimes inferred from patterns that recur too consistently to be coincidental. The most direct line of inheritance ran through the maritime labor movement that emerged in the decades following the Republic's collapse. The sailors who had served aboard pirate ships and survived, whether through pardon, acquittal, or simple good fortune, returned to the merchant service and the Royal Navy carrying with them the memory of an alternative. They had experienced a system in which their labor was valued, their voice was heard, and their welfare was protected. They returned to a system in which none of these things were true. The contrast was corrosive. Throughout the 1720s and 1730s, the Royal Navy and the merchant fleet experienced an escalating series of labor disputes that bore the unmistakable imprint of pirate organizational principles. Crews refused to sail until grievances about food, wages, or discipline were addressed. Sailors organized collective petitions demanding written agreements specifying the terms of their service. In several documented cases, merchant crews drew up articles modeled explicitly on pirate articles that specified wage rates, working conditions, and procedures for resolving disputes with officers. They called these documents round robins, signing their names in a circle around the text so that no single signature appeared first and no individual could be identified as the ringleader. The round robins were not pirate articles. They did not establish democratic governance or elected leadership. They were, at most, collective bargaining agreements of a primitive kind, demands presented to authority rather than alternatives to authority. But they represented the transmission of a key insight from the pirate community to the broader maritime labor force, that written agreements, collectively negotiated and universally binding, were a mechanism through which working men could constrain the power of those who employed them. The pirates had not invented this insight. It had roots in earlier maritime custom and in the guild traditions of medieval Europe. But they had demonstrated it in its most radical form, and the demonstration had entered the working culture of the Atlantic maritime world. The transmission was not limited to the sea. As sailors moved between maritime and shore-based employment, as they settled in port cities and interacted with dock workers, tradesmen, and laborers, the organizational principles they carried with them seeped into the broader culture of working-class resistance. Historians of the 18th century labor movement, particularly Peter Linebaugh and Marcus Rediker in their collaborative work, The Many-Headed Hydra, have traced connections between pirate organizational practices and the emergence of collective labor action in the port cities of the Atlantic world. From London to Boston to Kingston, the connections are rarely direct enough to constitute proof of causation. No dockworkers' union constitution cites the Articles of Bartholomew Roberts as a precedent. But the patterns of organization, the insistence on written agreements, collective decision-making, equitable distribution of proceeds, and mechanisms for constraining authority recur with a consistency that suggests a shared cultural inheritance. The more famous line of inheritance, the one that connects the pirate republic to the American Revolution, is necessarily more speculative, but no less suggestive. The men who gathered in Philadelphia in 1776 to declare independence and in 1787 to draft the Constitution were not, in any direct sense, influenced by the pirates of Nassau. They were educated men who read classical philosophy and Enlightenment political theory. Their intellectual genealogy ran through Locke, Montesquieu, and the republican traditions of ancient Rome, not through the harbor front taverns of New Providence. And yet, the American colonies had been intimately connected to the pirate economy. Merchants in Boston, New York, and Charleston had purchased stolen goods from pirate middlemen for decades. Colonial governors had corresponded with pirate captains and, in some cases, collaborated with them. The trial of the pirate crew of Samuel Bellamy's Whydah had been conducted in Boston in 1717, a public spectacle that generated enormous local interest, and that exposed the colonial public to detailed accounts of pirate governance and social organization. Cotton Mather, the prominent Puritan minister, he had visited the condemned pirates in jail and published an account of his conversations with them, an account that, for all its moral condemnation, conveyed in considerable detail the pirates' self-justification and their critique of the social order. The pirate world and the colonial world were not separate spheres. They were interpenetrating communities connected by commerce, geography, and the movement of individuals between legitimate and illegitimate economies. The ideas that circulated in one community were available to the other, not through formal intellectual channels, but through the informal transmission networks of tavern conversation, newspaper reportage, trial testimony, and personal acquaintance. When Benjamin Franklin argued that government should serve the governed, he may not have been thinking of pirate captains who served at the pleasure of their crews, but the principle was the same, and the practical demonstration of that principle had occurred in Franklin's own Atlantic world within the living memory of men he might have known. The connection is unprovable and perhaps unnecessary. The point is not that the American founders learned democracy from pirates. The point is that the democratic impulse expressed itself independently in both communities, because both communities contained people who had experienced the consequences of unaccountable authority and who had arrived, through different paths, at the same conclusion, that the legitimacy of governance depends on the consent of the governed, and that written law collectively agreed upon is the only reliable constraint on the abuse of power. The pirate contribution to this shared inheritance was not intellectual. The pirates produced no treatises, no pamphlets, no philosophical arguments that entered the canon of political thought. Their contribution was existential. They proved that the thing could be done. They proved that ordinary people, without education, without wealth, without institutional support, could organize themselves democratically, could create functional legal systems, could distribute resources equitably, could hold their leaders accountable. They proved it not in theory, but in practice, not in a philosopher's thought experiment, but on the rolling deck of a ship in hostile waters, where the cost of failure was not embarrassment, but death. This proof mattered more than any pamphlet could have. Because the most powerful argument against democracy, the argument that elites have deployed in every century and every culture to justify their own dominance, is that ordinary people are incapable of self-governance, that they are too ignorant, too selfish, too short-sighted, too easily manipulated to be trusted with political power, that they require the guidance of their betters, whether those betters are kings, aristocrats, priests, or credentialed experts. This argument has been used to justify slavery, colonialism, authoritarianism, and every form of political exclusion that the powerful have ever imposed on the powerless. The pirates of Nassau refuted this argument with the only evidence that matters. They did it. They governed themselves, imperfectly, temporarily, within constraints that guaranteed their experiment would not endure. But they did it. And the fact that they did it, documented in the trial transcripts and articles and accounts that the empire preserved as evidence of criminality, stands as a permanent rebuttal to the claim that democracy is a luxury that only the privileged can afford. This is the afterlife of the Republic of Pirates. Not a chain of direct influence linking pirate articles to constitutional conventions, but something more fundamental, a proof of concept that entered the cultural groundwater of the Atlantic world and resurfaced wherever men and women who had been told they were unfit for self-governance decided to prove otherwise. It resurfaced on the docks of Boston and Liverpool, where sailors organized the first maritime unions. It resurfaced in the holds of slave ships, where enslaved Africans organized rebellions governed by collective decision-making and equitable distribution of risk. It resurfaced in the radical democratic movements of the 19th century, where working people demanded the political rights that propertied elites insisted they could not be trusted to exercise. It resurfaced wherever someone looked at a system built to benefit the few at the expense of the many and said, as Samuel Bellamy had said from the deck of a stolen ship, that a free man had as much right to determine his own fate as any king with 100 ships and an army at his command. The Republic of Pirates was not the origin of democratic thought. It was not the first democratic community in history, nor the most sophisticated, nor the most enduring. It was something both humbler and more significant. A spontaneous demonstration that democratic self-governance is not an invention requiring special circumstances, but a natural human response to the experience of its absence. The pirates did not set out to prove a political theory. They set out to build lives that were less miserable than the ones the empire had assigned them. And in doing so, they accidentally proved something that political philosophers had been arguing about for centuries and that the powerful had every reason to deny. The proof stands. The Republic does not. And the gap between those two facts, between the durability of the idea and the fragility of the institution, is the space in which the Republic's legacy lives. It is a cautionary legacy as much as an inspirational one. The pirates proved that democracy can emerge from anywhere. They also proved that democracy, once emerged, requires more than good intentions and shared grievance to survive. It requires economic sustainability. It requires institutional structures capable of resolving internal contradictions. It requires mechanisms for adapting to changing circumstances. It requires, above all, a degree of unity that the pirates of Nassau, divided by competing visions and individual ambitions, could never achieve. The men who gathered in Philadelphia 60 years later would grapple with exactly these requirements. They would succeed where the pirates failed, not because they were better Democrats, but because they had advantages the pirates lacked. A productive economic base, a literate population capable of participating in institutional governance, a shared threat that unified competing factions long enough to build the structures necessary for survival, and the historical examples, positive and negative, of every democratic experiment that had preceded them. Whether the pirate republic was among those examples, whether any delegate to the Constitutional Convention had read the trial transcripts or the general history and drawn lessons from the pirates' achievements and failures, is a question that the historical record cannot answer. But the parallels are too precise to be entirely coincidental. The separation of powers, the elected executive, the written constitution, the mechanisms for amendment and removal, the social contract voluntarily entered and binding on all parties, the insistence that authority derives from the consent of the governed and can be revoked when that consent is withdrawn. These were not ideas that required a single point of origin. They were ideas that arose independently in different communities at different times because they were responses to universal human experiences, the experience of powerlessness, the desire for autonomy, and the practical recognition that collective action requires collective rules. The pirates arrived at these ideas through the experience of the lash. The founders arrived at them through the experience of colonial taxation without representation. The enslaved people who would demand their own freedom arrived at them through the experience of bondage. Each group expressed the same fundamental insight in the language and institutions available to them. And each group's expression enriched the common inheritance of democratic thought. The Republic of Pirates was one expression among many. But it was the first in the modern Atlantic world to translate the democratic impulse into a functioning system of governance, however imperfect and however brief. It preceded the American experiment by 6 decades. It preceded the French Revolution by 7. It preceded the Haitian Revolution, the first successful slave revolt to produce an independent nation, by nearly a century. In the long, halting, unfinished history of human self-governance, the pirates of Nassau occupy a position of chronological priority that no amount of cultural erasure can revoke. They were criminals. They were violent men who inflicted suffering on innocent people. They were participants in an economy built on theft and, in some cases, on the slave trade they claimed to despise. They were not heroes in any conventional sense, and any account of their legacy that ignores their crimes in order to celebrate their politics is as dishonest as any account that ignores their politics in order to celebrate their crimes. But they were also the first community in the modern Western world to build from nothing a functioning democracy. And that fact, stubborn and documented and resistant to every attempt at erasure, is the Republic of Pirates' true and lasting inheritance. The question that remained, as the last pirate flags came down and the last articles were filed in Admiralty Court archives, was not whether the idea would survive. Ideas once demonstrated cannot be undemonstrated. The question was whether anyone would remember where the demonstration had taken place and who had performed it, and what it had cost them. Whether the names of the men who proved that democracy could grow from the bottom up would be preserved alongside the names of the men who built it from the top down, or whether the empire's version of history would prevail, and the pirates would be remembered only as the colorful villains of adventure stories, their political achievements buried beneath 3 centuries of treasure maps and skull and crossbones flags. That question was still being answered in the archives, in the underwater archaeology of the Whydah wreck, in the work of historians who had begun to read the trial transcripts not as records of crime but as records of political innovation. And the answer, still emerging, still incomplete, still contested, pointed toward a reckoning that the British Empire had hoped to prevent when it sent Woodes Rogers across the Atlantic with a pardon in one hand and a noose in the other. The reckoning was simple. The pirates had been right. Not about everything, not about the morality of theft or the acceptability of violence against innocent people or the sustainability of an economy built on plunder, but about the thing that mattered most, about the capacity of ordinary human beings to govern themselves, about the illegitimacy of any system that denied them that capacity, about the fundamental truth that would eventually reshape the political structures of the entire Western world. That authority which does not flow from the consent of the governed is tyranny, regardless of the crown it wears or the flag it flies. The pirates knew this. They wrote it into their articles. They lived it on their ships. They died for it on the gallows of Port Royal and Fort Nassau and Cape Coast Castle. And the world, 3 centuries later, was still catching up. The world was catching up. But it was catching up unevenly, and the path between the pirate articles and the modern democratic state was neither straight nor inevitable. It wound through centuries of struggle, regression, and rediscovery, and at every turning point, the same argument that the pirates had answered with their lives was relitigated by people who had never heard of Nassau's harbor or the articles signed within it. The first and most immediate testing ground was the sea itself. The Atlantic maritime world that had produced the pirates did not reform itself after the Republic's destruction. The conditions aboard Royal Navy and merchant vessels in the 1720s and 1730s were, if anything, worse than they had been before the golden age of piracy, because the authorities who had been frightened by the pirates' example responded not by addressing the grievances that had driven men to piracy, but by tightening the mechanisms of control designed to prevent them from acting on those grievances again. Impressment intensified. The Royal Navy, perpetually short of manpower, expanded the practice of kidnapping civilians from port towns and forcing them into service aboard warships. Press gangs roamed the docks of London, Bristol, Liverpool, and Boston, seizing any man who looked like he could haul a rope and dragging him aboard ships where he would serve for years without the possibility of release. In the legal fiction that impressment was a form of national service rather than enslavement was maintained by courts that understood perfectly well what it was, but considered the Navy's manpower needs more important than the liberty of common men. Discipline aboard ship grew harsher. The Admiralty, haunted by the memory of crews that had mutinied and turned pirate, encouraged captains to maintain order through exemplary severity. The number of lashes that could be administered without a court-martial increased. The offenses that warranted punishment expanded. Running the gauntlet, keel hauling, and confinement in irons became more frequent. The message was explicit. The pirates had demonstrated what happened when sailors were permitted to question authority. And the response was to ensure that questioning became so dangerous that no rational man would attempt it. The irony was that this escalation of repression produced exactly the outcome it was designed to prevent. The harsher the conditions, the more men deserted. The more men deserted, the more the Navy relied on impressment. The more the Navy relied on impressment, the less loyal and less competent its crews became. The less competent the crews, the harsher the discipline required to maintain basic operational capacity. The cycle was self-reinforcing, and it would continue with variations for the better part of a century until the conditions aboard British warships became so notorious that they generated a reform movement whose rhetoric, consciously or not, echoed the complaints that pirate crews had articulated generations earlier. Or the great naval mutinies of 1797 at Spithead and the Nore were the most dramatic expression of this inheritance. In April of that year, the crews of the Channel Fleet at Spithead, the anchorage off Portsmouth that served as the Royal Navy's primary base, refused to put to sea. They did not desert. They did not turn pirate. They remained aboard their ships, maintained discipline among themselves, and presented their officers with a list of demands that included increased pay, improved food, better medical treatment for the sick and wounded, and the removal of specific officers whom the crews considered brutal or incompetent. The organizational sophistication of the Spithead Mutiny would have been immediately recognizable to any veteran of Nassau's harbor. The crews elected delegates from each ship who met collectively to formulate demands and negotiate with the Admiralty. They drafted written articles specifying the terms under which they would return to duty. They established a separation between the delegates who managed the negotiation, functioning as quartermasters, and the petty officers who maintained daily operations aboard each vessel, functioning as captains. They imposed discipline on their own members, punishing drunkenness and disorder through collective decision rather than arbitrary authority. They created, in short, a temporary democratic polity aboard the warships of the Royal Navy, using organizational principles that had been refined aboard pirate vessels 80 years earlier. The Admiralty, after initial resistance, conceded to the Spithead demands. Pay was increased. Food quality was improved. The most brutal officers were removed. The mutineers returned to duty without punishment, and the Channel Fleet sailed within weeks to resume its station against the French. The Spithead Mutiny was, by any measure, a successful exercise in collective bargaining, and its success demonstrated that the principles underlying the pirate articles, written agreements, collective decision-making, the right to remove incompetent leaders, could function within the framework of a hierarchical institution without destroying that institution's capacity to operate. The mutiny at the Nore, which began 3 weeks after Spithead and was led by a former merchant sailor named Richard Parker, attempted something more radical and paid a correspondingly higher price. The Nore mutineers demanded not only improved conditions but structural changes to the Navy's governance, including the right of crews to veto their officers and a greater share of prize money. These demands went beyond reform and into the territory of the pirate articles themselves, challenging the fundamental distribution of power and profit aboard naval vessels. The Admiralty refused to negotiate. The mutiny collapsed after 5 weeks. Parker was hanged. Dozens of other mutineers were executed, flogged, or transported to penal colonies. The contrast between Spithead and the Nore illustrated a lesson that the pirates themselves had learned but had been unable to apply, that democratic principles could survive within a hostile institutional environment only if they were advanced incrementally, either through demands that the existing power structure could accommodate without feeling existentially threatened. And the Spithead mutineers asked for better treatment within the existing system. They got it. The Nore mutineers asked for a restructuring of the system itself. They were crushed. The distinction was one that every subsequent labor movement would have to navigate, and the navigation would always involve the same fundamental tension between pragmatism and principle that had divided Hornigold from Vane in Nassau's harbor a century before. The The maritime labor movements of the 19th century carried this tension forward into an era of industrial transformation that would have been unrecognizable to the pirates, but that reproduced on a vastly larger scale the conditions that had driven them to rebellion. The merchant fleet expanded enormously as global trade accelerated. Steam replaced sail, iron replaced wood. Ships grew larger, faster, and more dangerous. The crews that operated them remained in most respects as exploited as their predecessors had been in 1700. Wages were low. Hours were brutal. Safety was an afterthought. The legal protections available to sailors were minimal, and the enforcement of those protections was left to courts that consistently favored ship owners over seamen. In this environment, the organizational principles that had originated aboard pirate ships evolved into the institutional forms of the modern labor union. Sailors in the port cities of the Atlantic world began to form benevolent societies, mutual aid organizations that pooled contributions from members to provide assistance in times of illness, injury, or unemployment. The structure was new. The principle, collective provision for individual misfortune funded by shared contribution, was the same principle that had governed the injury compensation clauses of the pirate articles. The pirate crews had paid compensation from the common treasury before individual shares were distributed. The benevolent societies collected dues from members and dispersed benefits according to written rules that every member had agreed to upon joining. The mechanism had been formalized and civilianized, but its DNA was unmistakable. By the middle of the 19th century, these benevolent societies had evolved into unions that negotiated collectively with ship owners over wages, hours, and working conditions. The National Sailors and Firemen's Union, founded in Britain in 1887, and the Sailors' Union of the Pacific, founded in San Francisco in 1885, were direct institutional descendants of the informal collective actions that sailors had undertaken for generations. Their constitutions specified elected officers, democratic decision-making procedures, written agreements with employers, and benefits for members injured or killed in the course of their duties. Every one of these provisions had a precedent in the pirate articles. The line of descent was not a matter of conscious imitation. No union organizer sat down with a copy of Bartholomew Roberts's articles and modeled his constitution on them. The connection was cultural rather than textual, transmitted through the working practices and oral traditions of a maritime community that had been organizing itself along these lines for 2 centuries. The principles spread beyond the waterfront. As industrialization drew millions of workers into factories, mines, and mills, the organizational tools that maritime workers had developed were adapted to new contexts. The trade union movement that transformed the political landscape of the 19th and 20th centuries was built on foundations: elected leadership, written agreements, collective bargaining, mutual aid, democratic decision-making that had been tested and refined in the specific conditions of life at sea. The factory floor was not a ship's deck. The mine shaft was not a forecastle. But the fundamental dynamics were the same: a group of workers whose labor generated wealth they did not share, governed by authorities they had not chosen, subject to conditions they had no power to change, and discovering that collective organization was the only mechanism available to them for asserting their interests against the interests of those who employed them. The welfare state, that vast apparatus of social insurance that defines modern governance in every industrialized nation, has its own genealogy, one that runs through Bismarck's Germany, Lloyd George's Britain, and Roosevelt's America. But beneath the legislative histories and the policy debates lies a principle so fundamental that its origins are rarely examined. The principle that a community has a collective obligation to provide for members who are unable to provide for themselves, and that this obligation takes precedence over the individual accumulation of wealth. The pirate articles encoded this principle 2 centuries before any national government adopted it. The injury compensation schedules, the common fund from which disabled crewmen drew their payments, the priority of welfare over profit in the distribution of plunder, these were not bureaucratic innovations. They were moral commitments, expressed in the blunt language of men who knew what it meant to be injured and abandoned, and who had decided that no member of their community would suffer that fate. The distance between a pirate article specifying 600 pieces of 8 for the loss of a right arm and a modern workers' compensation statute specifying benefit levels for workplace injuries is enormous in every dimension except the one that matters most. Both express the same conviction that people who are harmed in the course of collective enterprise deserve collective support, and that the cost of that support is a legitimate charge against the enterprise's proceeds. The pirates did not invent this conviction. It exists in some form in every human community that has ever organized itself for collective labor. But they gave it a specific institutional form, a written schedule of benefits funded by a common pool that anticipated the structure of modern social insurance with a precision that cannot be attributed to coincidence. Whether any of the architects of the modern welfare state were aware of this precedent is again a question the historical record cannot definitively answer. But the structural parallels suggest that the pirate innovation was not an isolated anomaly, but an early expression of a principle that would eventually reshape the relationship between states and citizens across the industrialized world. The pirates arrived at the welfare principle not through political theory, but through lived necessity. They needed a mechanism for maintaining crew cohesion in an environment where injury was constant, and the absence of any safety net would have made every man's participation in combat a form of suicidal gamble. The modern state arrived at the same principle through a different route, driven by the political pressure of organized labor and the practical recognition that social instability threatened economic productivity, but the destination was the same. The pirate contribution to the history of racial politics in the Atlantic world is the most difficult thread to trace because the evidence is the most fragmentary and the temptation to project modern categories onto historical actors is the strongest. What can be said with confidence is this: the pirate community constituted one of the very few spaces in the 18th century Atlantic world where black and white men lived and worked together under conditions of approximate equality, and that this experience, however limited and however compromised by the broader context of the slave trade, represented a rupture in the racial order that the slaveholding societies of the Americas found profoundly threatening. The trial records and crew lists that survive from the golden age of piracy document the presence of black men aboard pirate vessels in numbers that cannot be explained by forced labor alone. Some of these men were formerly enslaved people who had escaped or been liberated from captured slave ships. Some were free black sailors who had joined pirate crews voluntarily. Some occupied positions of authority, serving as gunners, navigators, or even, in a few documented cases, as elected officers. Their presence aboard pirate ships was not invisible to the slaveholding world. Colonial governors' dispatches frequently noted with alarm that pirate crews included Negroes who bore arms and fought alongside white crewmen. The alarm was not about the pirates' military capability. It was about the example they set. A black man with a cutlass and an equal share of plunder was the slave-holding South's worst nightmare made flesh. He was proof that the racial hierarchy on which the entire plantation economy depended was artificial, maintained by force rather than by nature, and that black men given the opportunity could function as autonomous agents, as fighters, as decision-makers, as citizens of a self-governing community. Every enslaved person who heard through the maritime grapevine that connected every port in the Atlantic that pirate crews included black men who lived free and fought as equals received a piece of information that the slave-holding class would have given anything to suppress: the information that an alternative existed. The connection between pirate racial practices and the broader history of black resistance in the Atlantic world is necessarily speculative. There is no documented case of an enslaved person citing pirate example as inspiration for rebellion. The influences were too diffuse, the channels of transmission too informal, and the participants too illiterate for such direct connections to survive in the written record. But the cultural historians who have examined the networks of information that connected enslaved communities across the Atlantic, the songs, the stories, the coded messages passed between ships and plantations and port town taverns, have identified a persistent thread of knowledge about alternative communities where the racial order did not apply: maroon settlements in the mountains of Jamaica and Suriname, free black communities in the cities of the northern colonies, and pirate ships where the article said every man and meant it at least some of the time. The significance of this thread was not that it inspired specific acts of resistance, it was that it maintained within enslaved communities the knowledge that the existing order was not the only possible order, that black freedom was not a theoretical abstraction, but a lived reality, experienced by specific individuals in specific places, documented by the very authorities who sought to suppress it. This knowledge was itself a form of resistance, a refusal to accept the slaveholders' foundational lie that black people were naturally suited to bondage and incapable of self-governance. The pirates had not set out to challenge that lie. Many of them, as participants in the slave trade, had actively reinforced it. But their community, by its very existence, had generated evidence that contradicted it, and that evidence circulated through the Atlantic world long after the community itself was gone. The gender legacy of the Republic is similarly complicated and similarly resistant to simple narrative. Anne Bonny and Mary Read became, in the centuries following their trial, symbols of female defiance whose meaning shifted with each generation's understanding of gender, power, and autonomy. In the 18th and 19th centuries, they were curiosities, anomalies, whose transgression of gender boundaries was treated as evidence of individual eccentricity rather than systemic critique. Johnson's general history presented them as remarkable women whose courage exceeded that of the men around them, but the framing was one of exception rather than precedent. They were extraordinary precisely because they were women doing things that women were not supposed to do. The system that excluded women from combat, from political participation, from economic autonomy, was not questioned by their example. It was reinforced because their exceptionalism implicitly confirmed the rule. The feminist reinterpretation of Bonny and Read began in the late 20th century and continues to evolve. Scholars like Joe Stanley, Marcus Rediker, and Laura Sook Duncombe have reread the trial transcripts and the general history through the lens of gender theory, arguing that Bonny and Read's transgression was not merely personal, but structural. They did not simply break rules. They exposed the arbitrariness of the rules themselves. The pirate articles excluded women on the premise that their presence would disrupt crew cohesion. Bonny and Read demonstrated that women could enhance crew cohesion by contributing to collective defense with a courage that shamed the men who had sought to exclude them. Their example did not change the pirate community's gender policies, but it entered the historical record as documentary evidence that those policies were based on assumption rather than fact, and that evidence would become politically significant in eras when the broader project of women's liberation required historical precedents for female agency in male-dominated spaces. The cultural afterlife of the pirate republic in the 21st century has taken forms that the pirates themselves would have found bewildering, but that reflect in distorted ways the same tensions that animated their community. The pirate aesthetic, the skull and crossbones, the black flag, the romanticized image of lawless freedom on the open sea has been adopted by movements and subcultures that share little beyond a generalized rejection of established authority. Anarchist collectives, cryptocurrency enthusiasts, open-source software advocates, and anti-copyright activists have all, at various times, claimed the pirate flag as a symbol of their resistance to centralized control. The Pirate Party, a political movement that originated in Sweden in 2006 and has since established chapters in dozens of countries, explicitly invokes the pirate tradition in its advocacy for digital rights, government transparency, and the reform of intellectual property law. These appropriations are not entirely superficial. The Pirate Republic's core innovation, the creation of a self-governing community organized around written agreements, elected leadership, and the equitable distribution of collectively generated value, resonates with contemporary movements that seek to build alternative structures outside the control of states and corporations. The open-source software movement, in which volunteer programmers collaborate to create and maintain code that is freely available to anyone, operates on principles that bear a structural resemblance to the pirate articles: voluntary participation, collective governance, equitable access to the product of collective labor, and the subordination of individual profit to community benefit. The cryptocurrency movement, for all its contradictions, was animated in its early years by a vision of financial autonomy that the pirates would have understood. The desire to conduct economic activity outside the control of institutions that the participants regarded as exploitative and illegitimate. But the appropriations are also inevitably selective. The contemporary movements that invoke the pirate tradition tend to embrace the Republic's democratic innovations while ignoring its violence, its participation in the slave trade, and the economic unsustainability that guaranteed its collapse. The pirate flag, in its modern usage, has been sanitized in much the same way that Hollywood sanitized it, being stripped of its historical complexity and reduced to a symbol of generic rebellion that can be applied to any cause without requiring engagement with the difficult questions that the actual pirate community forces us to confront. The most difficult of those questions is the one that the Republic's entire history poses, and that no subsequent democratic experiment has fully answered. How do you build a just society from unjust materials? The pirates of Nassau were products of a brutal system. They carried that brutality with them into the community they built. Their democracy coexisted with violence against innocent people. Their egalitarianism coexisted with participation in the slave trade. Their written law coexisted with the practical reality that disputes were often settled by whoever was more willing to use a blade. The Republic was not a clean break from the world that produced it. It was a rearrangement of the same human materials, an attempt to build something better from components that were themselves damaged by the system the builders were trying to escape. This is the condition of every revolutionary project. The people who build new worlds are formed by the old ones. They carry with them the assumptions, the prejudices, the habits of mind and behavior that the old world instilled in them, and those carried elements inevitably shape the new world in ways that compromise its founding aspirations. The American founders, for all their philosophical sophistication, could not escape the logic of slavery that saturated their society. The French revolutionaries, for all their universalist rhetoric, could not escape the class resentments that drove them to the terror. The pirates, for all their democratic innovation, could not escape the violence and racial hierarchy that defined the Atlantic world they had rejected. The recognition of this pattern is not a counsel of despair. It is a counsel of honesty. The Republic of Pirates was a genuine political achievement accomplished by genuinely flawed human beings within genuinely limiting historical circumstances. To celebrate its achievements without acknowledging its failures is hagiography. To dismiss its achievements because of its failures is cynicism. The honest assessment lies between these poles in the recognition that imperfect people building imperfect institutions under impossible conditions is not a deviation from the history of democracy. It is the history of democracy. Every democratic experiment in the history of the world has been conducted by flawed people who fell short of their own ideals. The question is not whether they fell short, but whether the ideals themselves were worth pursuing and whether the attempt, however compromised, advanced the broader project of human self-governance. By this standard, the Republic of Pirates was not merely a success. It was a foundational contribution to a project that remains unfinished. The pirates proved that democracy does not require prerequisites. They proved that written law can emerge from collective negotiation rather than elite imposition. They proved that leadership can be accountable to those it serves. They proved that the fruits of collective labor can be distributed equitably. They proved that communities can provide for their most vulnerable members. They proved all of this in conditions of extreme adversity, without resources, without education, without institutional support, without any of the advantages that subsequent democratic experiments would enjoy. And they proved something else, something that the 3 centuries separating their world from ours have not diminished. They proved that the desire for self-governance is not a luxury of the comfortable, but a necessity of the human spirit, a need as fundamental as food, water, and shelter, a need that will express itself wherever it is suppressed, in whatever form the circumstances allow, with whatever tools are available, no matter how crude the tools or how hostile the circumstances. The pirate articles were crude tools. The circumstances were as hostile as any that democratic innovators have ever faced, and the republic they built was brief, violent, contradictory, and ultimately unsustainable. But it was also the first time in the modern Western world that a community of working people, acting without guidance from above, wrote their own laws, chose their own leaders, and governed themselves according to principles that the rest of the world would spend centuries struggling to adopt. That is not nothing. That is, in fact, everything. Because it means that the democratic impulse is not a product of civilization. It is the thing that civilization at its best is built to serve. And the pirates of Nassau, for all their crimes, understood this truth more completely than the powdered gentleman who hanged them. The harbor at Nassau received ships of a very different kind in the decades after Rogers's administration transformed it from pirate capital to colonial outpost. Merchant brigs carrying salt raked from the flats of the outer islands, small sloops transporting sponges harvested from the shallow banks, occasional naval vessels on patrol, their officers noting in their logs that the settlement was orderly, quiet, and desperately poor. The Bahamas without piracy had almost nothing to offer the imperial economy. The islands produced no sugar, no tobacco, no indigo. The soil was too thin, the rainfall too irregular, the labor force too small. Nassau survived on subsistence fishing, wrecking, and the modest trade generated by its position along the shipping lanes. The same geographical advantage that had made it a pirate haven, now providing just enough legitimate commerce to sustain a colonial administration that London funded grudgingly and intermittently. The pardoned pirates who remained in Nassau aged into a generation of men whose stories no one bothered to record. They had names once, written in the register that Rogers kept, but the register recorded only the act of submission, not the lives that followed. A few surface in scattered documents. A former pirate who became a harbor pilot and was commended for his knowledge of the channels. A former pirate who was arrested for wrecking and claimed, in his defense, that he had been salvaging rather than luring. A former pirate who died in the fever epidemic of 1721 and was buried in the sandy soil behind the settlement, his grave unmarked. His pirate name forgotten, his legal name recorded in a parish register that would crumble to dust in a subsequent hurricane. These men, the anonymous majority of the Republic's population, left no legacy that can be individually identified. They did not write memoirs. They did not give interviews. They did not preserve their articles or their recollections for posterity. They lived out diminished lives in the margins of a colonial order that had absorbed them the way an ocean absorbs a raindrop, completely and without trace. Whatever they had learned about self-governance, whatever they had experienced of democracy and egalitarianism and collective provision for collective need, they carried to their graves. But they carried it to their graves in a world that was changing, in ways they could not have foreseen, in directions their experience had helped to define. The Atlantic world of the 1720s and 1730s was a world in ferment. The Enlightenment was gathering force in the salons and coffee houses of London and Paris. Philosophers were articulating, in the language of reason and natural rights, principles that the pirates had enacted in the language of articles and cutlasses. The great political revolutions of the 18th century were still decades away, but the intellectual groundwork was being laid, and the groundwork included, whether its architects knew it or not, the empirical demonstration that ordinary people could govern themselves. The specific mechanisms of transmission were as tangled and untraceable as ocean currents. A sailor who had served aboard a pirate ship told his story in a tavern in Bristol, and a young man who heard it carried the story to the American colonies, where it merged with other stories, other grievances, other visions of what a just society might look like. A trial transcript was published in a London newspaper, and a reader who would never go to sea absorbed, without knowing it, the idea that written agreements between equals were a viable alternative to commands imposed from above. A copy of Johnson's General History sat on a shelf in a colonial library, and a young man whose name would later appear on a Declaration of Independence leafed through its pages on a rainy afternoon, pausing at the passage where Samuel Bellamy declared himself a free prince with as much authority as any king, and felt something stir in his chest that he could not yet name. These moments of transmission are invisible to history. They left no documentary trace. They cannot be proven, only inferred from the remarkable convergence of principles that linked the pirate articles of the 1710s to the political documents of the 1770s and 1780s. The convergence may be coincidence. It may be the independent emergence of similar solutions to similar problems. It may be the result of a shared cultural inheritance so diffuse that no single channel of influence can be identified. Whatever its explanation, the convergence is real. And it suggests that the Republic of Pirates, for all its brevity and all its flaws, was not an isolated episode in the history of human self-governance, but a current in a much larger stream. Yes, a stream that had been flowing since the first time a group of human beings looked at the power structure governing their lives and decided that they could do better. That stream carried forward through the 18th century with a force that no empire could dam, though many tried. And as the decades passed, as the last men who had signed pirate articles died in obscurity on islands and in port towns scattered across the Atlantic, the stream gathered tributaries from sources that had nothing to do with piracy and everything to do with the same elemental human refusal that had filled Nassau's harbor with stolen ships and free men. In the 1760s, when colonial merchants in Boston began to argue that taxation without representation was tyranny, they were articulating a principle that every pirate who had ever voted on the division of plunder would have recognized instantly. The pirate articles had established, as a matter of practical governance, that no man could be compelled to contribute to the common enterprise without having a voice in how the proceeds were distributed. The Boston merchants expressed the same principle in more elegant language, but the substance was identical. The right to participate in decisions that affect your life and your livelihood was not a philosophical innovation of the 1770s. It was a working principle of the 1710s, tested not in debating chambers, but on gun decks, enforced not by courts, but by the collective will of men who had agreed freely to be bound by rules they had written themselves. And when Thomas Jefferson sat down in a rented room in Philadelphia in June of 1776 to draft the Declaration of Independence, he wrote that governments derive their just powers from the consent of the governed. The sentence has been quoted so often that its radical content has been dulled by familiarity. But place it beside the pirate articles, which established that a captain's authority derived from the crew's vote and could be revoked by the same mechanism, and the kinship is unmistakable. Jefferson was writing political philosophy. The pirates had been writing operational procedure. But the principle was the same, and the pirates had implemented it first in conditions that made Jefferson's rented room look like a palace of comfort and security. When the Constitutional Convention assembled in Philadelphia in 1787, Inacum Warrens, the delegates debated the separation of powers with an intensity that reflected their understanding of how easily concentrated authority could become tyrannical. They divided the federal government into three branches, each checking the others, each deriving its authority from a different source, each constrained by written rules that no single branch could unilaterally change. The structure was original in its specific design, but not in its underlying logic. The pirate ships of Nassau had operated under a separation of powers that divided authority between the captain, who commanded in battle, and the quartermaster, who governed in all other matters, each elected independently, each accountable to the crew, each constrained by the articles that both had sworn to uphold. The American founders achieved their separation of powers through philosophical reasoning and historical study. The pirates achieved theirs through the practical experience of watching what happened when a single man held unchecked authority aboard a ship at sea. The routes were different, the destination was the same. These parallels do not prove influence, they prove something more important. They prove universality. The democratic principles that the pirates enacted and that the American founders codified were not inventions of either group. They were discoveries, uncovered independently by people operating in radically different circumstances, because the principles themselves are embedded in the logic of human cooperation. Any group of people who must work together under conditions of shared risk and shared reward will, if free to organize themselves, tend toward arrangements that distribute decision-making authority, constrain individual power, establish written rules, and provide for collective welfare. The pirates discovered this in the forecastle. The founders discovered it in the library. The discovery was the same because the underlying reality was the same. Human beings who experience tyranny develop an allergy to it, and the institutional expression of that allergy is democracy. This is the Republic of Pirates' deepest and most enduring contribution to the human story, not a specific institution, not a direct line of influence, not a historical cause that produced a historical effect, but something more fundamental, evidence. Evidence that the democratic impulse is not a product of privilege, education, or cultural refinement. Evidence that it arises spontaneously from the bottom up, in any community where people have experienced the alternative and are free to choose. Evidence that the powerful are wrong when they claim that ordinary people cannot govern themselves. Evidence that the desire for self-determination is not a learned behavior but a human constant, as reliable as gravity and as difficult to suppress permanently. The empires that crushed the pirate republic understood on some level the threat that this evidence represented. The British Crown did not send Woodes Rogers across the Atlantic because 1,000 pirates on a limestone island posed a serious military challenge to the most powerful navy on Earth. It sent Rogers because the existence of a self-governing community of common sailors, visible to every merchant crew and every colonial population in the Atlantic, undermined the foundational claim on which the entire imperial order rested, that hierarchy was natural, that authority flowed downward from God through king, through noble, through officer to common man, and that any disruption of this order was not merely illegal, but against the natural design of the universe. The pirates' harbor was a standing refutation of that claim. Every ship that entered Nassau and saw elected captains, written articles, and equitable divisions of plunder carried that refutation back to every port in the Atlantic world. Every sailor who served aboard a pirate vessel and then returned to the merchant fleet carried with him the lived knowledge that another way was possible. The empire could hang individual pirates. It could burn individual ships. It could offer pardons that fractured pirate communities along the fault lines of self-interest, but it could not undemonstrate the demonstration. It could not erase the knowledge that ordinary men had governed themselves and that the system had worked. This is why the destruction of the Republic was accompanied by such thorough cultural erasure. The trial transcripts reframed democratic governance as criminal conspiracy. The execution sermons reframed collective self-determination as sinful rebellion against divine order. The popular narratives reframed political actors as romantic adventurers or bloodthirsty villains, categories that were entertaining but politically inert. The empire did not merely defeat the pirates. It rewrote their story, converting a political challenge into an adventure tale, a democratic experiment into a crime spree, a proof of concept into a cautionary narrative about the wages of sin. The rewriting held for a quarter of a millennium. It held through the American Revolution, when the men who built a nation on principles the pirates had pioneered made no mention of the precedent. It held through the age of abolition, when the complicated racial history of pirate crews was buried beneath the simpler narrative of plantation slavery and its opponents. It held through the labor movements of the 19th and 20th centuries, when workers who fought for the rights the pirate articles had codified, fair wages, safe conditions, collective bargaining, disability compensation, did so without knowing that illiterate sailors had secured those rights for themselves 200 years earlier. It held through the 20th century's world wars and ideological struggles, when democracy was celebrated as the product of Western civilization's highest achievements, and the pirate contribution to its genealogy was dismissed as irrelevant or ignored entirely. The rewriting began to crack in the final decades of the 20th century, not because the evidence had changed, but because the questions being asked of the evidence had. Historians trained in the methods of social history, attuned to the experiences of ordinary people rather than the pronouncements of elites, looked at the pirate trial transcripts and saw not criminal proceedings but political documents. They read the articles and recognized constitutions. They examined the voting procedures and identified democratic practice. They studied the injury compensation schedules and discovered early social insurance. They did what the empire had spent 3 centuries preventing anyone from doing. They read the pirates' own records on the pirates' own terms, and they found a political achievement that demanded recognition. The recognition is still incomplete. The Republic of Pirates remains a marginal topic in the standard histories of democratic governance, a curiosity rather than a chapter, a footnote rather than a precedent. The mainstream narrative of democracy's development still runs from Athens through Rome, through the Magna Carta and the English Civil War, through Locke and Montesquieu and the Enlightenment, through Philadelphia and Paris and the long struggle for universal suffrage without passing through Nassau's harbor. The pirates are still, in the popular imagination, adventure figures rather than political ones, their black flag signifying rebellion in the abstract rather than democracy in the specific. But the crack in the old narrative is widening, and what presses through it is the stubborn, documented, irrefutable fact of what these men built. Not what they stole, not how they fought, not the theatrical terror of Blackbeard's smoking beard or the romantic defiance of Anne Bonny's parting words to a man who would not fight. What they built. A system, a set of rules, a way of organizing human beings that placed authority in the hands of the governed, distributed resources with rough equity, provided for the vulnerable, constrained power through written law, and held leaders accountable to those they led. They built it in 12 years on an island no one wanted. Yet they built it without books, without teachers, without any model except the negative model of the system they had escaped. They built it with rum-stained hands and salt-cracked lips, in a harbor protected by sandbars and governed by articles that smelled of gunpowder. They built it because they had been beaten, starved, robbed of their labor's value, and denied any voice in the conditions of their own lives, and they had decided, with the clarity that only suffering can produce, that they would rather risk death than endure that treatment for one more day. And then the empire came, and they were offered a choice that was no choice at all, and most of them took the pardon because most people, in most circumstances, choose survival over principle. And that choice is not cowardice, but the simple human preference for breathing over not breathing, which is the oldest and most forgivable of all human preferences. But some of them did not take the pardon. Charles Vane did not take it. He sailed out of Nassau's harbor through the eastern channels with the British flag rising behind him, and he kept sailing, and he kept fighting, and he kept refusing, until the sea and the empire and the weight of his own isolation ground him down and delivered him to the gallows at Port Royal, where he died without apology, without regret, and without the satisfaction of knowing that the thing he had fought for would outlast the empire that killed him. It did outlast it. The British Empire is gone. Its colonies are independent nations. Its navy is a fraction of its former strength. Its monarch is a ceremonial figure whose political power is negligible. The hierarchy that the pirates rejected, the divine right of kings, the inherited authority of aristocrats, the presumption that birth determined worth, has been dismantled so thoroughly that it is difficult from the vantage point of the 21st century to remember how absolute and how suffocating it once was. The pirate articles, by contrast, survive. They survive in the archives where they were filed as evidence of crime. They survive in the pages of Johnson's General History, which has never gone out of print in 300 years. They survive in the underwater archaeology of the Whydah wreck, where the material reality of pirate life is being recovered from the sand of Cape Cod, one artifact at a time. And they survive in the principles they encoded. Principles that are now so deeply embedded in the political and economic structures of the modern world that their origins have been forgotten, which is perhaps the truest measure of their success. Every time a worker files a compensation claim for an injury sustained on the job, the pirate articles are present. Every time a union negotiates a collective bargaining agreement, the pirate articles are present. Every time a citizen casts a vote to choose or remove a leader, the pirate articles are present. Every time a written constitution constrains the exercise of power by dividing authority among separate offices, the pirate articles are present, not as a direct cause, not as a conscious influence, but as a precedent, the earliest modern demonstration that these principles could function in practice, tested under conditions of extreme adversity by people with no advantages except their own experience and their own determination. The world the pirates imagined, a world where a man's worth was measured by his contribution rather than his birth, where leaders served the led, where law was written by the people it governed, where the fruits of collective labor were shared rather than confiscated, has not been fully achieved. It may never be fully achieved. The distance between the ideal and the reality remains vast, and the forces that profit from that distance remain powerful. The hierarchies that the pirates rejected have been replaced by new hierarchies, less visible perhaps, less dependent on hereditary title and more dependent on accumulated capital, but no less effective at concentrating power in the hands of the few and extracting wealth from the labor of the many. But the vision persists. It persists because it is rooted not in theory, but in experience. And the experience of inequality generates the vision of equality as surely as the experience of darkness generates the desire for light. The pirates did not create this vision. It existed before them and would have existed without them. What they did was prove that the vision was not a fantasy, that it could be translated into functioning institutions, that ordinary people could do the translating, that the prerequisites the powerful insisted upon, the education, the property, the pedigree, the philosophical sophistication, were not prerequisites at all, but barriers erected by those who benefited from the existing order to prevent those who suffered under it from imagining and building an alternative. The alternative was always there. It was there in the forecastle, where men whispered about how things might be different. It was there in the harbor, where crews voted on their captains and signed articles that gave them rights no king had ever granted. It was there on the gallows, where men who had tasted freedom chose death over a return to bondage. It was there in the archives, preserved in documents whose authors never imagined that anyone would read them as anything other than evidence of guilt. And it is here now, in the principles that govern every democratic society on earth, principles whose pedigree includes, whether the democratic societies acknowledge it or not, a sun-blasted harbor in the Bahamas where 1,000 criminals built a republic. The harbor is still there. The sandbars that protected the pirate fleet have shifted with 3 centuries of storms and currents, but the basic geography remains. The approach from the east is still shallow. The water inside the harbor is still calm. The trade winds still blow from the southeast, carrying the smell of salt and the faint chemical tang of the deep ocean. Stand on the waterfront in Nassau today, amid the cruise ship terminals and the duty-free shops and the straw market where tourists buy souvenirs emblazoned with the Jolly Roger, and you are standing on the ground where Benjamin Hornigold argued strategy with captains who would be dead within 5 years, and where Edward Teach loaded pistols and wove slow-burning fuses into his beard, where Charles Vane stood on a beach and watched a British flag rise over a harbor he had sworn to defend, where Anne Bonny walked away from the last man who tried to tell her what she could not do. The ground does not remember them. The sand has been covered with concrete. The coral stone of the original buildings has been quarried and replaced a dozen times over. The fort where 9 men were hanged on a December morning in 1718 is gone, its stones scattered, its location marked by a historical plaque that tourists photograph and do not read. But the water remembers. Not literally, not sentimentally, but in the way that geography remembers the forces that shaped it. The harbor exists because the sandbars exist. The sandbars exist because the currents and the coral built them over millennia into a formation that happened to be perfect for small, shallow draft vessels and impassable for large, deep-hulled ones. This accident of geology created the conditions for the Republic of Pirates. It gave 1,000 desperate men a sanctuary that the most powerful navy on earth could not breach. It gave them time. Time to organize, to experiment, to build, to fail, to try again. Time to discover through practice rather than theory that they were capable of governing themselves. The time ran out. It always runs out. Every democratic experiment from Athens to Philadelphia to Nassau operates within a window that history opens and history closes. And the measure of the experiment is not whether it endured forever, but what it demonstrated while the window was open. The pirates of Nassau demonstrated enough. They demonstrated that democracy is not a gift bestowed by the powerful upon the deserving. It is a thing that people build from whatever materials are available whenever the conditions permit, because the need for it is not cultural or intellectual, but human. They demonstrated that the principles of self-governance, elected leaders, written law, equitable distribution, collective welfare, separation of powers, are not the inventions of philosophers but the discoveries of practitioners, arrived at independently by anyone who has lived under the alternative and refused to accept it. They demonstrated that the argument against democracy, the argument that ordinary people are too ignorant, too selfish, too irresponsible to govern themselves, is not merely wrong but self-serving, an argument made by those who benefit from the ignorance, selfishness, and irresponsibility of the systems they control. And they demonstrated one thing more. One thing that the empires and the hierarchies and the comfortable beneficiaries of unequal systems have never been able to answer, despite 3 centuries of trying. They demonstrated that when human beings are free to choose, when the lash is removed from their backs and the chains from their wrists and the silence from their throats, they do not choose chaos. They do not choose savagery. They do not descend into the war of all against all that Hobbes predicted, and that every tyrant has invoked to justify the maintenance of order through force. They choose rules. They choose fairness. They choose accountability. They choose to take care of each other. They choose, in a word, democracy, not because they have been taught to, not because they have read the right books or attended the right schools or inherited the right traditions, but because democracy is what human beings build when they are finally, after lifetimes of being told they cannot, permitted to build something for themselves. The last pirate ship to fly a black flag over Nassau's harbor did so on a morning in late July of 1718, as Woodes Rogers's squadron materialized from the tropical haze and the Republic's brief, extraordinary, impossible existence entered its final hours. The flag came down, the articles were surrendered, the votes were cast for the last time. The men who had governed themselves walked forward to accept pardons from an empire that would never acknowledge what they had achieved. And the harbor that had sheltered the most radical political experiment in the Atlantic world received, in place of pirate sloops, the merchant vessels and naval frigates of the order that had been restored. The empire recorded a victory. The pirates recorded nothing. They were illiterate men who left no memoirs, no manifestos, no account of what they had built or why it mattered. They left only the articles, scrawled on parchment in harbors and forecastles, signed with names and marks by men who understood that the document they were creating was a contract, here a constitution and a declaration of independence all at once. Those articles are still legible. The ink has faded, but the words remain. And the words say, in language stripped of every ornament and pretension, what the most powerful political documents in human history would later say in grander prose, that authority belongs to the governed, that leaders serve at the pleasure of those they lead, that the law applies equally to every person who lives under it, that the community provides for those who sacrifice on its behalf, that no man is born to rule and no man is born to obey. The pirates wrote these truths before anyone else in the modern Western world wrote them down. They lived these truths before anyone else demonstrated that they could be lived, and they died, many of them, rather than surrender these truths to an empire that found them intolerable. The empire is dust. The truths remain. And somewhere beneath the turquoise water of Nassau's harbor, beneath the concrete and the coral and the accumulated sediment of 300 years, the sand still holds the faint impression of keels that once sheltered there, the ghost marks of ships that carried free men under black flags, in a republic that lasted just long enough to prove that such a thing was possible. It was possible. The pirates proved it. And the proof, once entered into the record of human experience, can never be expunged. It sits in the archives, patient and permanent, waiting for each new generation to discover it and to recognize, with a shock that never quite diminishes, that the dream of self-governance is older, deeper, and more resilient than any of the forces that have ever been marshaled to suppress it. The pirates knew this. They did not have the words for it, but they knew it. They knew it in the way that a man who has been beaten knows the value of dignity, in the way that a man who has been silenced knows the value of a voice, in the way that a man who has been robbed of his labor's worth knows the value of a fair share. They knew it in their scars and in their bones, and they built a world that honored what they knew, and that world lasted just long enough to leave its mark on the world that came after. The mark is faint. You have to know where to look. But it is there, scratched into the bedrock of every democratic institution on earth, the indelible trace of 1,000 men who refused to be governed by anyone but themselves, who wrote their own laws on stolen parchment with salt-stained hands, who voted in harbor front taverns where the currency was Spanish silver and the stakes were life and death, and who proved in the brief time allotted to them that the thing the powerful said could not be done had already been done, by the very people the powerful despised most. The trade winds carry no memory, the ocean keeps no record, the sand shifts and the coral grows, and the harbor that sheltered the Republic of Pirates is now a harbor that shelters cruise ships. And the transformation is so complete that standing on its shore today, you would never know that anything had happened here that mattered. But it mattered. It mattered more than the men who built it knew, and more than the empire that destroyed it intended, and more than the centuries that followed have acknowledged. It mattered because it was the first proof offered by the last people anyone expected to offer it, that the thing we now call democracy is not a luxury, not a privilege, not a reward for good behavior or proper breeding or sufficient education. It is a birthright. It belongs to every human being who has ever drawn breath, and it will assert itself again and again in every age and in every place, as long as there are people who know what it means to live without it. The pirates of Nassau knew, and in knowing, they gave the rest of us permission to demand it. The harbor is quiet now. The flags are different. The ships are larger. The world has changed in ways that would be incomprehensible to the men who once anchored here, their decks loaded with stolen silver, their articles signed, their captains elected, their futures uncertain, and their freedom, for that brief, bright interval, their own. But the water is the same water, and the wind is the same wind. And somewhere in the space between what was and what is, in the gap between the empire's version of history and the truth preserved in faded ink on crumbling parchment, the Republic of Pirates endures. Not as a place, not as a government, not as an institution or a territory or a flag. As a question, the oldest question, the only question that has ever mattered. Who decides? The pirates answered it. And the answer, carried forward on a current older than any empire, is still arriving.